James Harris Simons was an American mathematician, hedge fund manager, and philanthropist who built one of history's most successful quantitative trading operations. Born in Brookline, Massachusetts, to a middle-class Jewish family, Simons earned a PhD in mathematics from UC Berkeley at age 23 and became a codebreaker for the Institute for Defense Analyses during the Cold War. His mathematical breakthroughs, particularly the 1974 Chern-Simons theory, remain foundational in theoretical physics and geometry. In 1978, Simons pivoted from academia to finance, founding what became Renaissance Technologies in 1982. His flagship Medallion Fund, launched in 1988, achieved annualized returns estimated at 66% gross, 6% gross, 39% net after fees from 1988 to 2018, arguably the best investment record ever recorded, outperforming Warren Buffett, George Soros, and Ray Dalio by multiples. Unlike traditional investors, Simons employed mathematicians, physicists, and computer scientists to build proprietary trading algorithms, pioneering modern quantitative finance. At his death in May 2024, Simons' net worth was estimated at $31.5 billion by Forbes. He transformed Renaissance into a $130 billion AUM juggernaut while keeping Medallion, that is closed to outside investors since 1993, a closely guarded secret. Post-2000, Simons channeled billions into scientific research and education through the Simons Foundation, established in 2004, funding autism research, mathematics, and physics. His legacy spans three domains: pure mathematics, Chern-Simons invariants, quantitative finance, algorithmic trading, and large-scale philanthropy. He died of natural causes in New York City on May 10, 2024, age 86. Welcome to Richie Rich Stories. Do not forget to subscribe, like the video, leave a comment, and share the videos with friends. This audiobook is based on true events, but some event, places, people, and conversations are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The soft whir of an industrial fan provided a gentle percussion to the quiet that otherwise filled the shoe factory after hours. The slant of golden October light through high windows caught dust motes and made them dance, momentarily golden themselves before settling on the neat rows of inventory. Matthew Simons moved between the shelves with practiced ease, checking boxes and occasionally making a notation in his leather-bound ledger. "Jim, would you count the women's Oxfords in the back? We need to know if we should order more leather for next week." Behind a stack of boxes, a lanky teenager nodded, his dark hair falling over serious eyes. Jim Simons, 16 and already showing signs of the methodical mind that would define him, didn't waste motion or words. He simply began counting, his fingers moving in a quiet dance across box tops, occasionally pausing to check inside one for verification. 23 pairs in size 6, 18 in 7, 12 in 8, he called back. Without being asked, he added, "That's down 12% from last month's inventory at this time." Matthew looked up, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You didn't need to calculate the percentage." Jim shrugged. "It's just division. The numbers were there." This was Newton, Massachusetts, 1954, a place where practicality was currency, where working in your father's shoe factory after school wasn't just expected, it was character building. The war had been over for nearly a decade, but its memory lingered in the careful way people used what they had, the hesitation before any indulgence, the quiet pride in American manufacturing that employed men like Matthew Simons. For Jim, the factory had become a universe of ordered parts, a system that could be quantified, understood, and therefore predicted. Even as a child, he had shown an unusual relationship with numbers. Where other boys saw baseball statistics as background to the drama of the game, Jim saw patterns, relationships between variables that seemed to whisper secrets meant only for those who knew how to listen. "Your mother expects us home by 6, Matthew said, closing his ledger. "I told her we'd pick up some ice cream on the way." "The Brightons called earlier," Jim replied, emerging from behind the shelves. "They wanted to know if we could deliver those special orders tomorrow instead of Friday." Always business before pleasure with the Brightons, Matthew sighed, but there was no resentment in it. Business was the steady heartbeat of places like Newton. Jewish families like the Simons had learned long ago that economic self-sufficiency was more reliable than the goodwill of others. Outside, Newton's streets were peaceful as twilight settled. American-made cars lined the curbs, solid and chrome-heavy, built to last like everything else from that era of post-war optimism. The shoe factory wasn't large, but it was respectable. A brick building with Matthew Simons's name discreetly displayed above the door. It provided for the family without ostentation, embodying the values Matthew had instilled in his son: reliability, precision, and the importance of keeping one's accounts in order. "I got a letter from MIT today," Jim said as they walked toward the car. Matthew's pace slowed almost imperceptibly. "And?" "They want me to interview. Professor Levinson was impressed by my mathematics exam." A careful nod from Matthew. "Your mother will be pleased." What went unspoken was the weight of this possibility. MIT represented a doorway not just for Jim but for the family. The Simons' name was respectable in Newton, but academia offered a different kind of security, one that depended on intellect rather than the vagaries of commerce. At home on Oak Hill Road, Marcia Simons was setting the table, the radio playing softly in the background. Sinatra, whose smooth voice had replaced the big bands of the war years. The house was modest but well kept, books lining shelves in the living room, a testament to the family's quiet intellectualism. "There he is," Marcia said, her smile warming as she saw her son. She was a practical woman, her dark hair pulled back, her movements efficient. "Did you help your father with the inventory?" "He did more than help," Matthew replied. "He calculated percentage changes without being asked." "Numbers just sit differently for me," Jim said, taking plates from the cabinet to help set the table. "They have relationships. It's like they want to tell you things." Marcia exchanged a glance with Matthew, a look that contained pride, hope, and perhaps a touch of uncertainty. Their son had always been different, his mind constantly working in ways that sometimes left them struggling to keep up. Later that evening, after dinner had been cleared and Matthew had retired to his study with the newspaper, Jim sat at his desk, the small lamp casting a pool of light on his mathematics notebooks. Beyond the window, Newton slept, a suburb of good families with good intentions, of corner stores and streetcars and children who played stickball in vacant lots. Marcia appeared in the doorway, watching her son work. "MIT would be a fine school," she said. Jim looked up. "It's where the problems are. The interesting ones. Your father is proud, you know. He doesn't always say it." Jim nodded. The silent understanding between them acknowledged what neither would say directly, that Jim's future would likely take him far from the shoe factory, from inventory lists and leather orders. His mind belonged to abstractions that couldn't be contained in his father's ledger books. "I know," he said simply. "Just remember where you come from," Marcia said, her voice soft. "Numbers are wonderful things, but they're not everything." Jim smiled slightly. "They're predictable, though. They don't change the rules halfway through." Marcia's expression was knowing. The world of 1954 had rules that were unspoken but rigid. Jewish families like theirs knew about quotas and subtle exclusions, the invisible lines drawn through society. Numbers, at least, played fair. "Get some rest," she said. "Tomorrow's another day." When she had gone, Jim returned to his equations, but his mind drifted back through the years, piecing together the moments that had shaped his relationship with mathematics. He remembered being 7 years old in 1945, sitting on the floor of their previous, smaller house, listening to the radio announce that the war was over. The adults had talked about something called an atomic bomb, a weapon designed by mathematicians and physicists that had ended the conflict. Even then, as a child, he had understood numbers had power. The right equation, properly applied, could change the world. At school, mathematics had never been work for him. While other students struggled with long division, Jim found himself drawn to the elegant patterns beneath the surface, the way prime numbers hid among the integers like secrets, the beautiful symmetry of geometric proofs. His 8th grade teacher, Mr. Feynman, had been the first to recognize that Jim's ability went beyond mere calculation. "You don't just solve problems, James," he had said, looking over a test paper covered in Jim's neat handwriting. "You seem to converse with them." Jim had shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention but pleased by the recognition. "The answers are just there, sir. You just have to know how to look." Now, as he worked through a complex differential equation, that same feeling returned, the sense that mathematics wasn't a subject to be mastered, but a landscape to be explored, a language more precise than English could ever be. The equation resolved itself under his pencil, the variables falling into place with a neatness that satisfied something deep in his nature. There was order here, patterns that could be trusted. In a world still rebuilding itself after war, where political loyalties were questioned and accusations flew, mathematics remained constant, a foundation that couldn't be shaken by human caprice. A week later, Jim found himself in a small cafe near the shoe factory, sitting across from his friend Daniel Kleineman. They'd known each other since elementary school, two Jewish boys from similar backgrounds, though Daniel's father owned a hardware store rather than a factory. "MIT, Daniel said, stirring his coffee. "That's impressive, Jim. My father nearly fell over when I told him." "I haven't been accepted yet," Jim replied, characteristically cautious. "Just an interview." "Please, with your mathematics scores, they'd be fools not to take you." Outside the cafe window, Newton continued its unhurried pace. A streetcar rumbled past, women in modest dresses and men in hats moving along the sidewalks. The Korean War had ended the previous year, and there was a tentative optimism in the air. Though the newspapers carried stories about Senator McCarthy and his hunt for communists that cast a shadow over intellectual pursuits. "What about you?" Jim asked. "Harvard still?" Daniel nodded. "Pre-law, my father says I should aim for corporate law, more stable." Stability, that watchword of their parents' generation, who had lived through the Depression and war, who valued security above all. Jim understood it, but something in him resisted the narrowness of such thinking. "There's more than one kind of stability," he said. "Says the mathematician," Daniel laughed. "Not all of us can live in the world of perfect equations." But that was just it. Jim didn't see mathematics as separate from the real world. It was the hidden structure beneath everything, business, science, perhaps even human behavior. Patterns were everywhere, waiting to be recognized, analyzed, used. As they left the cafe, Jim noticed a discarded newspaper on a bench. The headline reported stock market gains, with a smaller story below about advances in computing at IBM. He picked it up, scanning the numbers in the financial section. "My uncle says the market's been good lately," Daniel commented, watching him. "He bought some General Electric last year, made a decent return." Jim nodded absently, his eyes moving over the columns of figures. "There are patterns here too," he said. "Not random at all, if you know what to look for." Daniel glanced at his watch. "I should get back. My father's expecting me to help with inventory." The word triggered a memory from Jim's earliest days, helping at the shoe factory. He'd been perhaps 12, counting boxes, when he'd noticed a discrepancy in the ordering pattern. "Dad," he'd said, "we're ordering the same number of each size, but we sell more of some than others." Matthew had looked up from his paperwork. "What do you mean?" "Size 7 sells faster than size 9. We should order more 7s and fewer 9s. It would be more efficient." Matthew had stared at him for a moment, then smiled slowly. "Show me the numbers." That afternoon had been the first time Jim had seen his father truly value his way of thinking, not just as a curiosity, but as something practical. Together they had reorganized the inventory system based on sales patterns, and within 3 months, the factory had reduced waste and improved cash flow. Now, as he and Daniel parted ways, Jim found himself thinking about those inventory numbers again. Patterns in shoe sales, patterns in stock prices, different contexts, but perhaps not so different in essence. Both systems could be measured, analyzed, predicted. That evening at dinner, the MIT interview was the main topic of conversation. "Professor Levinson says the mathematics department is expanding," Jim told his parents. "They've got new funding for research since Sputnik." The Russians have certainly lit a fire under our government, Matthew commented, passing the potatoes. Suddenly, everyone wants to be a scientist or a mathematician. Not just anyone can do it, though, Marcia said with quiet pride in her voice. It takes a special mind. Jim shifted uncomfortably under the implicit praise. It's just about seeing the relationships. Anyone could learn. No, son, Matthew said with unusual directness. Your mother's right. What comes easily to you is difficult for most people. Don't diminish that gift. The conversation moved on to other topics. A cousin's wedding, the price of leather, a new development being built at the edge of town. But Jim remained thoughtful, turning over his father's words. He had never considered his mathematical ability as anything remarkable. It was simply the way his mind worked, as natural as breathing. Later, as he helped his mother clear the table, she paused, her hands deep in soapy water. You know, she said, her voice pitched low so Matthew wouldn't hear from the living room, your grandfather. My father was good with numbers too. He kept the books for 3 different businesses back in Poland. People trusted him because the numbers always balanced. Jim looked at her with surprise. She rarely spoke of her family's life before America. What happened to him, he asked. A shadow crossed her face. The war. The Germans came to our town in 1941. She didn't elaborate, but she didn't need to. Jim knew enough history to fill in the blanks. She dried her hands on a dish towel. He used to say that numbers were the one true international language. They mean the same thing in every country, to every person. Jim thought about this as he finished drying the plates. A universal language, uncorrupted by prejudice or politics. There was something profound in that idea, something that resonated with his own experience of mathematics as a refuge of clarity. That night, he lay awake long after the house had gone quiet, thinking about his grandfather whom he'd never met, tallying figures in a world that would soon be destroyed. About his father, meticulously keeping inventory in a shoe factory in Newton. About himself, solving differential equations that seemed to exist in some perfect realm beyond the messiness of human affairs. 3 generations, connected by numbers, by the belief that within them lay some essential truth about the world, some order that could be discerned and relied upon. Outside his window, the maple trees that lined their street rustled in a gentle breeze. America in 1954 was a place of contradictions, prosperous yet anxious, triumphant yet fearful. The shadow of McCarthy loomed over intellectual life. The wounds of war were still fresh. The Cold War created new tensions. But here in Newton, in this modest house, Jim Simons had found a kind of certainty in the elegant logic of mathematics, a foundation that seemed unshakable. As sleep finally claimed him, numbers danced behind his eyelids, not as mere quantities but as relationships, patterns, possibilities. Somewhere in those patterns, though he couldn't yet see it clearly, lay a future different from anything his parents might imagine. Not the security of a steady profession or a respectable business, but something more elusive, the pursuit of problems worthy of his particular mind. In the years to come, that pursuit would take him far from Newton, from inventory sheets and leather shipments. But the lessons of those early years would remain. The value of precision, the power of observation, the patience to let patterns reveal themselves. And perhaps most importantly, the understanding that numbers, properly read, tell stories as rich and complex as any human drama stories written in the one truly universal language. The fall of 1955 brought a particular crispness to Cambridge, Massachusetts. Maple leaves turned brilliant crimson and gold along Massachusetts Avenue as Jim Simons walked toward MIT's mathematics building, a slide rule tucked under his arm and a paper-bagged lunch in his pocket. At 23, his lean frame and quick gait betrayed an energy that couldn't be contained by conventional pace. Around him, students hurried between classes while professors in tweed jackets discussed matters of consequence, nuclear physics, information theory, the eternal truths of mathematics. The world was changing. Just months earlier, Disneyland had opened in California, a testament to American optimism. The Salk vaccine had been declared safe, conquering the polio specter that had haunted parents for decades. Science was ascending, promising solutions to humanity's oldest problems. Jim felt the current of history, though he would never have articulated it so grandly. "Simons," called a voice from across the quad. A fellow student waved, and Jim nodded acknowledgement but didn't slow his pace. The mathematics department awaited, and inside those halls he found a tranquility that eluded him elsewhere. The clean perfection of equations, the elegant architecture of proofs. Inside the mathematics building, the air carried the comforting scent of chalk dust and floor wax. Blackboards stretched across walls, covered in dense notation that would have been indecipherable to outsiders, but read like poetry to Jim. He settled into his preferred seat in the advanced analysis seminar, arranging his notebook precisely at the desk's center. "We continue with manifold theory," announced the professor, a man whose name would soon be forgotten in the pantheon of Jim's influences. The chalk scratched against the blackboard and Jim's mind accelerated, not merely following but anticipating the progression of theorems. When Jim returned to his modest apartment that evening, he sat at his desk beneath the yellow cone of a reading lamp. Outside, distant car horns punctuated the Massachusetts night. He opened his notebook to continue working on a problem that had occupied him all day, a question of multi-dimensional analysis that had implications he couldn't yet fully grasp. His roommate, an engineering student, poked his head in. "Some of us are heading to that coffee place on Boylston. Jazz quartet playing tonight." Jim looked up, momentarily disoriented, as if waking from a dream. "Thanks, but I've got this thing I'm working through." His roommate shook his head with good-natured resignation. "You know what they say about all work and no play." After the door closed, Jim returned to his equations. The work wasn't merely work to him. It was a landscape to explore, a universe with its own laws and hidden symmetries. The hours melted away as he pushed deeper into the mathematical wilderness. By 1957, the world had shifted on its axis. On an October night, Jim stood with a crowd of students and professors on MIT's rooftop, all gazing upward at the clear autumn sky. Somewhere up there, a small Soviet sphere called Sputnik orbited the Earth, broadcasting a simple electronic beep that changed everything. America's complacency had been shattered by a beach ball-sized satellite. "This changes the game," murmured a professor standing nearby. "Congress will be falling over itself to fund mathematics and physics now." Jim barely registered the comment. His eyes remained fixed on the stars, but his mind was elsewhere, calculating orbital mechanics, considering the geometry of space. In the following weeks, as newspapers declared a national crisis and politicians demanded action, Jim found that his chosen field had suddenly become a matter of national security. Mathematicians were no longer eccentric academics, but potential saviors of Western civilization. The National Defense Education Act passed in 1958, flooding universities with research money. For the first time, being a mathematician carried a patriotic duty. Jim observed this shift with mild amusement. He hadn't chosen mathematics for its suddenly strategic importance, but for its intrinsic beauty and challenge. In the basement computer rooms, where massive IBM mainframes hummed and clattered through punch cards, Jim occasionally joined other graduate students in running calculations. The machines filled entire rooms, generating enough heat to make shirt sleeves necessary even in winter. The future was being coded on these primitive giants, one punch card at a time. "I'm heading to Berkeley for my doctorate," Jim announced to his advisor one spring afternoon in 1958. His undergraduate years at MIT had built his foundation, but he was drawn westward by two names, Bertram Costant and Xing Shen Chern. His advisor nodded approvingly. "Costant's work on Lie theory is revolutionary, and Chern, there's no one better in differential geometry. They'll push you." Jim smiled slightly. "That's what I'm counting on." The University of California at Berkeley in 1958 presented a different atmosphere than MIT's buttoned-down practicality. The campus sprawled beneath eucalyptus trees, while in nearby San Francisco, the fading beat movement gave way to something not yet named. The air carried hints of ocean salt and eucalyptus, and the light had a golden quality that made the East Coast seem perpetually grey by comparison. Jim settled into a small apartment near campus, its shelves soon filled with mathematics journals and dog-eared textbooks. His daily routine became a circuit between his apartment, the mathematics department, and occasionally a coffee shop where he would sit for hours, filling pages with notation while espresso cooled beside him. Bertram Costant, his doctoral advisor, was a revelation, brilliant, demanding, and possessed of an intuitive grasp of abstract structures that Jim aspired to match. Their meetings often ran for hours, beginning with specific questions about Jim's dissertation research and expanding into wide-ranging mathematical explorations. The beauty of Lie theory, Costant once told him during a late afternoon session, is that it reveals the hidden symmetries governing apparently chaotic systems. It's not just mathematics, it's a philosophy of order beneath complexity. Jim nodded, absorbing the concept. This approach, finding patterns in apparent randomness, would become a fundamental aspect of his thinking, though its applications lay years in his future. Even more influential was Xing-Shen Chern, whose work in differential geometry represented the pinnacle of the field. Though not formally his advisor, Chern became a profound influence on Jim's mathematical development. The Chinese-American mathematician moved through complex geometric concepts with an elegance that made the abstract seem tangible. Geometry, Chern told him during the seminar, is not about memorizing formulas. It's about seeing, truly seeing, the shape of truth. Jim's dissertation began taking form, an exploration of the multidimensional Gauss-Bonnet theorem, extending classical results into new realms. The work required rigorous proof discipline, combined with geometric intuition, the ability to perceive relationships in spaces that couldn't be physically visualized. One evening, as Jim worked in his apartment, the radio murmured news in the background. Castro's revolutionaries had taken Havana. Alaska was becoming America's 14th state. Elvis Presley was entering the army. The world continued its turbulent dance, while Jim inhabited a realm of abstract forms and rigorous proofs. His neighbor knocked on the door, breaking his concentration. "Some of us are watching the Twilight Zone premiere tonight. Got some beers and everything." Jim hesitated. The social world often seemed unnecessarily complicated compared to the clean logic of mathematics. Still, there were times when even he recognized the need to surface from abstraction. "Sure," he said. "Give me 10 minutes to finish this proof." By 1960, Jim's doctoral work was accelerating toward completion. Berkeley's mathematics department hummed with activity. Seminars crowded with brilliant minds, blackboards covered with notation that represented the frontier of human understanding. The campus itself was changing, with new international-style buildings rising to accommodate the post-Sputnik expansion of scientific education. His dissertation on multidimensional Gauss-Bonnet theory was taking shape, laying groundwork for ideas that would bear fruit years later. The work required not just technical skill, but a kind of mathematical creativity, the ability to see connections between seemingly disparate areas, and to build bridges between established theory and uncharted territory. In the department lounge one afternoon, Jim found himself in conversation with a visiting professor from Princeton. "What's your standard for accepting a result?" the visitor asked, stirring sugar into his coffee. Jim considered the question carefully. 3 sigma confidence, at minimum, he replied. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. The professor nodded approvingly. Too many young mathematicians rush to publish. They mistake cleverness for rigor. This insistence on validation, on results that could withstand intense scrutiny, became core to Jim's approach. It wasn't enough to believe something was true. One needed proof that met the highest standards. As 1961 approached, Jim found himself increasingly recognized within the mathematical community. Professors from prestigious institutions began to take notice of his work, and whispers circulated about faculty positions at places like Harvard and MIT, a remarkable prospect for someone not yet 30. "You understand what academic salaries are like, right?" joked a fellow doctoral candidate as they walked across campus one day. 8 to 12,000 a year if you're lucky. We're not exactly heading for Wall Street riches. Jim shrugged. I'm not particularly interested in money. The work matters. At that moment, he believed it entirely. In the academic world, prestige outweighed compensation. A breakthrough paper in the annals of mathematics carried more value than any bonus. The currency was intellectual respect, not dollars. In the spring of 1961, Jim defended his dissertation. The room was filled with mathematics faculty, their faces attentive as he outlined his extensions to the Gauss-Bonnet theorem. When he finished his presentation, the questions came, probing, challenging, exploring the boundaries of his work. Jim answered with quiet confidence, occasionally stepping to the blackboard to sketch a proof or clarify a definition. This was the crucible where mathematical thinking was tested, where hand-waving and intuition had to give way to precise reasoning. After the committee conferred, his advisor returned with a smile. "Congratulations, Dr. Simons." At 23, Jim had completed his PhD in mathematics, building a foundation of skills that would serve him far beyond the academic world: statistical thinking, pattern recognition, and an unwavering insistence on proof before action. His toolkit was assembled, though he couldn't yet know all the ways he would use it. That evening, Berkeley's lights twinkled below as Jim stood on a hillside overlook. San Francisco Bay stretched before him, the Golden Gate Bridge illuminated against the darkening sky. In his pocket was a letter, an offer of a position at MIT's mathematics department. The path ahead seemed clear: return to Cambridge, join the faculty, pursue research, perhaps eventually secure tenure. It was the standard trajectory for a mathematician of his caliber. The salary would be modest, perhaps $10,000 a year, but the prestige was substantial. He thought about Constant and Chan, about the mathematical community he had joined, about the elegant structures he spent his days exploring. There was a purity to this world that appealed to him, a meritocracy of ideas where brilliance mattered more than background. A cool breeze carried the scent of eucalyptus as Jim considered his future. Mathematics had given him a particular lens through which to view reality, seeing patterns where others saw randomness, finding order in complexity, demanding rigorous proof before accepting conclusions. These habits of mind would remain with him, regardless of where his path led. As darkness settled over Berkeley, Jim descended the hill toward his apartment. Tomorrow he would begin packing his few possessions for the return to the East Coast. MIT awaited, and with it, the next chapter in a life dedicated to the pursuit of truth through numbers. What he couldn't know, standing on that California hillside in 1961, his doctorate newly completed, was how the mathematical toolkit he had assembled would eventually be applied. The elegant theories of differential geometry and the statistical disciplines he had mastered would someday form the foundation for something entirely different from academic papers and university seminars. But that future remained unwritten as Jim walked through the Berkeley night, his mind already turning to the problems he would tackle next, the theorems waiting to be proven, the elegant mathematics that had become his life's focus. The slide rules and mechanical calculators would give way to computers, punch cards would become obsolete, Sputnik's beep would fade into history as men walked on the moon. But the fundamental patterns, the mathematics underlying reality, those remained constant. And Jim Simons had developed an uncommon ability to perceive those patterns, a talent that would eventually transform not just his life, but entire fields of human endeavor. For now, though, he was simply a young mathematician at the beginning of his career, walking through a California evening, contemplating the elegant structures of differential geometry and the austere beauty of mathematical truth. The chalk dust hovered in the slanted afternoon light of the lecture hall, tiny white particles suspended like stars in a private universe. Jim Simons stood at the blackboard, one hand still pressed against an elegant proof he'd just completed, the other absently brushing powder from his tweed jacket. The Harvard mathematics department had grown silent, a peculiar kind of reverence that wasn't for him, but for the beauty of what he'd just demonstrated. And that, he concluded with characteristic understatement, is how we might approach this particular problem. The room exhaled collectively, Outside, Cambridge in autumn 1963 continued its dance of falling leaves and hurried students. But in here, time had momentarily suspended, while minds grappled with abstract concepts far removed from the material world. Professor Raoul Bott nodded appreciatively from the front row. "Elegant work, Jim. Very elegant indeed." Afterward, walking along the Charles River with its brackish scent rising to meet the cool evening air, Jim considered how different his life had become in such a short span. Just the previous year he'd secured a faculty position at MIT, and now Harvard had extended an invitation as well. At 34, his reputation in the field of differential geometry was solidifying, though Jim himself would be the last to acknowledge it. The modest apartment he rented in Somerville welcomed him home with familiar austerity. Academic salaries afforded a comfortable, if unspectacular, existence, his approximately $10,000 annual income sufficient for the essentials but little else. The place was spare, bookshelves sagging with mathematical journals and monographs, a serviceable desk, and a record player currently silent in the corner. On the kitchen table lay his latest correspondence from Xing Shen, his former mentor at Berkeley, who continued to push and challenge his thinking. Jim filled a kettle and lit the stove, the blue flame dancing beneath tarnished metal. While water heated for tea, he removed his jacket and loosened his tie, transformation complete from public mathematician to private self. He extracted Chern's letter again, reading between the lines of mathematical notation for the real message: keep building. Keep connecting. The work matters. Later that evening, his colleague Tom Lehrer arrived with a bottle of inexpensive wine. A mathematician himself, but increasingly known for his satirical songs, Lehrer represented the kind of intellectual versatility Jim quietly admired. "The Harvard crowd treating you well?" Lehrer asked, accepting the glass Jim offered. "Well enough. Though I suspect they're more interested in the geometry than the geometer." Lehrer laughed. "That's academia for you. We worship at the altar of ideas while the priests survive on crackers." "The compensation is adequate," Jim replied with a small smile. "And the problems are magnificent." "Yes, well, some of us need to supplement our income with musical mockery." Lehrer raised his glass. "To differential geometry, may it eventually be as lucrative as it is incomprehensible to the masses." Jim chuckled, though the notion seemed absurd. Mathematics, particularly the pure mathematics he pursued, had never been a path to financial prosperity. The wealth he accumulated was different: intellectual capital, network connections, the respect of peers who recognized something in him that transcended his specific contributions. The following week found Jim in his office at MIT, walls adorned with nothing but a chalkboard filled with his precise handwriting. Bertrand Constant, his colleague and friend, leaned against the doorframe. "You've seen the department meeting agenda?" Constant asked. "I have. And your thoughts on the proposed curriculum changes?" Jim set down his pencil. "I think mathematics should be taught as it's practiced, collaboratively, with emphasis on problem-solving rather than pedigree. Some will argue that traditional foundations must come first." "They're wrong," Jim said simply. "I've seen brilliant minds stifled by that approach. What matters is raw ability to see patterns, to think past conventional approaches." Constant smiled faintly. "You've always had unusual opinions about talent." "Not unusual, just empirical." This philosophy was becoming something of a quiet crusade for Jim. In faculty meetings at both MIT and Harvard, he argued for recruitment based on problem-solving capability rather than credentials or specialization. Some colleagues found this approach radical, perhaps even threatening to academic tradition. But others, particularly those who had collaborated directly with Jim, recognized that his perspectives on mathematics and mathematicians emerged from a deeper understanding of how breakthrough work actually happened. The Cuban Missile Crisis had passed the previous October, but its shadow lingered across academic Cambridge. Faculty lounge discussions still occasionally turned to nuclear annihilation, though more often they returned to departmental politics and research funding. Jim generally avoided both topics, preferring instead to discuss the elegant interplay between differential geometry and topology that consumed his professional attention. One cold December afternoon, Jim drove his used Volkswagen Beetle across the Harvard Bridge, the engine protesting against the winter wind. Kennedy had been assassinated just weeks earlier, and a pall had fallen over the usually bustling campuses. The promise of intellect shaping the nation's future suddenly seemed less certain. He parked near Building 2 and made his way to MIT's mathematics department, nodding to colleagues along corridors that smelled of floor wax and radiator heat. Professor Isidore Singer intercepted him. "Jim, good timing. I've been hoping to discuss something with you." They retreated to Singer's office, where diagrams of fiber bundles covered most available surfaces. Singer closed the door. "I've been corresponding with Michael Attia at Oxford about some connections between your work and index theory. There's something fascinating happening at the intersection." For the next 2 hours, the men lost themselves in discussion, building mathematical structures in the air between them, occasionally rushing to the chalkboard to capture particularly promising threads. This was Jim in his element, collaborative, focused, engaged in the pure intellectual exchange that valued ideas above ego. Singer was technically senior to Jim in academic hierarchy, but in these sessions such distinctions dissolved. As they wrapped up, Singer looked at him curiously. "You know, Jim, for someone doing such significant work, you have an unusual way of downplaying your contributions." "I'm just a mathematician," Jim replied with his characteristic shrug. "The work speaks for itself." "That's precisely what I mean," Singer said. "Most rising stars in the field broadcast their genius. You seem determined to redirect attention from yourself to the mathematics." Jim gathered his notes. "Because the mathematics is what matters." Walking home that evening through Harvard Square, Jim passed bookshops and espresso bars where animated conversations spilled out into the cold night. Folk music drifted from Club 47, where performers like Joan Baez had been drawing crowds. The cultural landscape was shifting, but Jim remained somewhat apart from it, his attention focused elsewhere. At a crosswalk, he encountered a former student now working for Lincoln Laboratory, part of the defense research apparatus, Professor Simons. "How's the pure math world treating you?" "Well enough," Jim replied. "And your work in applied signals?" The former student looked around before answering more quietly. "Fascinating problems, and the government funding is substantial." Jim nodded, filing away this information without comment. The disparity between academic compensation and defense-related work wasn't news, but the gap was widening. Still, he felt no particular pull toward applied work, despite occasional whispers about mathematicians making significant contributions and receiving significant compensation. In government cryptography programs, spring 1964 brought longer days and the gradual thaw of Cambridge. Jim found himself increasingly in demand for conferences and collaborations, his reputation among peers continuing to grow despite, or perhaps because of, his self-effacing manner. While some colleagues jockeyed for position and recognition, Jim simply solved problems, built relationships, and followed his mathematical curiosity. After a particularly productive seminar series, Jim joined a small group of colleagues at the faculty club, where dark wood paneling and the scent of pipe tobacco created an atmosphere of deliberate timelessness. The conversation turned, as it occasionally did, to career trajectories. "Academia is a peculiar economy," observed one professor, swirling amber liquid in a heavy glass. "We trade in prestige rather than dollars." "Some of us do both," countered another, who supplemented his income with corporate consulting. Jim, nursing a single beer, listened more than spoke. His own financial picture remained modest but stable. His apartment was paid for, he owned his car outright, and his needs were few. What he valued was the freedom to pursue problems that interested him, and the company of minds that challenged his own. Later that evening, walking home under a canopy of stars partially obscured by campus lights, Jim considered his place in the academic ecosystem. At both MIT and Harvard, he existed in an unusual position, respected enough to have influence, yet deliberately maintaining a low profile that kept him somewhat insulated from departmental politics. His thoughts turned to the letter he'd received that morning from the Institute for Defense Analyses, expressing interest in his potential contributions to their mathematics research group. The salary mentioned was substantially higher than his current academic positions. He'd set the letter aside, neither immediately attracted nor repelled by the possibility. Back in his apartment, Jim sifted through journals before bed, making notes on promising approaches to ongoing problems. A photo on his desk showed him with Chern and Costant at a conference the previous year, three mathematicians of different generations bound by shared language and purpose. These relationships, more than any particular discovery, represented what Jim valued most about his academic life: the ongoing conversation across time and space, the collaborative pursuit of truth through mathematical reasoning. As spring moved toward summer, Jim found himself increasingly drawn to questions that bridged his work in geometry with the developing field of topology. The mathematical community, small and interconnected, provided both intellectual stimulation and a social framework that suited his temperament. One evening, returning from a lecture series at MIT, Jim encountered a colleague who had recently left academia for private industry. "Don't you miss the work?" Jim asked, genuinely curious. "Sometimes," the man admitted, "but I don't miss wondering how to afford my children's education on an assistant professor's salary." Jim nodded, understanding the calculation even if he hadn't made the same choice. Without family obligations, his own financial needs remained modest, allowing him the luxury of intellectual pursuit without immediate material concerns. At a department gathering later that week, Jim found himself in conversation with a visiting mathematician from Princeton who had connections to both academic and government research. "Your work on minimal varieties has implications beyond pure mathematics," the visitor observed. "Perhaps," Jim acknowledged, "though those applications aren't my primary interest." "That may change," the visitor said with a knowing smile. "There are problems outside academia that might engage your particular talents." Jim offered a non-committal response, but the comment lingered. He had always defined himself simply as a mathematician, focused on abstract problems for their intrinsic beauty and challenge. Yet he was becoming aware that others saw something different in him, a breadth of understanding and approach that might extend beyond traditional academic boundaries. The summer of 1964 brought new collaborations and the completion of several papers that further cemented his reputation in the field. His habit of working intensively with other leading mathematicians, absorbing their perspectives, contributing his insights, finding unexpected connections, had become his signature approach. On a warm August evening, Jim sat on the small balcony of his apartment, papers spread across a folding table as the sounds of Cambridge drifted up from below. A letter from the Institute for Defense Analyses lay among his notes, their interest in his potential contributions now formalized into an offer. The salary was indeed substantial compared to his academic positions, and the mathematical problems, while classified, had been described in sufficiently general terms to pique his interest. As darkness fell and street lamps illuminated the elm-lined streets below, Jim considered his path forward. The academic world had provided intellectual community and the freedom to pursue pure mathematics on his own terms. Yet he sensed that remaining exclusively within that world might ultimately prove limiting. Not financially, though that was a factor, but in terms of the problems he might encounter and the impact his work might have. Setting the letter aside, Jim turned his attention back to his current research. The decision could wait a little longer. For now, there were still fascinating questions to explore within the familiar confines of differential geometry, and colleagues at both MIT and Harvard with whom productive collaboration continued. In the quiet of his modest apartment, surrounded by books and papers rather than material wealth, Jim Simons continued to build the intellectual foundation that would, in ways he could not yet imagine, eventually transform into an entirely different kind of capital. The mathematician who insisted he was just a mathematician was already something more, a connector of ideas, a spotter of unusual talent, a synthesizer of disparate approaches. These qualities, rather than any specific theorem or proof, would ultimately define his most significant contributions. Outside, Cambridge continued its eternal cycle of academic seasons, unaware that one of its quiet professors was gradually developing perspectives and habits that would eventually reshape fields far beyond the mathematics departments where he currently made his home. For now, though, Jim Simons remained what he claimed to be, just a mathematician, pursuing beautiful problems in the company of those who shared his passion for elegant solutions. Princeton, 1964. The campus glittered with autumn gold as Jim Simons walked the tree-lined path toward the Institute for Defense Analyses building. The red brick colonial structure stood apart from the Gothic spires of the university proper, intentionally separate, intentionally discreet. Jim adjusted his tie, a gesture that had become habitual since leaving the freewheeling world of academia for this more structured environment. The morning air carried the scent of fallen leaves and possibility. At 36, he had already established himself as a formidable mathematician, but the problems that awaited him behind IDA's secure doors offered a different kind of challenge. "Morning, Dr. Simons," said the guard, checking his identification badge before buzzing him through the security checkpoint. "Beautiful day." "That it is," Jim replied, his voice carrying the slight trace of a Boston accent that years in academia had never quite erased. Inside, the institute hummed with a particular energy, the quiet intensity of brilliant minds working on problems they could never discuss at dinner parties. The hallways were carpeted to muffle footsteps, the offices arranged to minimize accidental exposure to information one wasn't cleared to see. Even the cleaning staff had background checks. Jim's office was Spartan but comfortable. A blackboard covered one wall, equations crawling across its surface like cryptic insects. His desk held a framed photo of his family and a stack of journals cleared for his level of access. His salary, nearly triple what he'd earned as a professor, afforded certain comforts, but it wasn't the money that had drawn him here. It was the puzzles. "Jim, got a minute?" Leonard Baum's head appeared around the doorframe, his thick glasses magnifying already intense eyes. "For you, Len? Always." Baum slipped inside and closed the door. A mathematician with a gift for probability and statistics, he had become Jim's closest colleague at IDA. Together, they navigated the intersection of pure mathematics and applied cryptography, developing algorithms that could detect patterns in what appeared to be random noise. "I've been working on something," Baum said, his voice automatically lowering even in the privacy of Jim's office. "A new approach to Markov chains that might have applications beyond what we're doing here." Jim's interest piqued. "Show me." Baum sketched rapidly on the corner of Jim's blackboard, outlining what would eventually become known as hidden Markov models, statistical tools that could identify patterns in sequences where the underlying state was not directly observable. "It's beautiful," Jim said when Baum finished, genuinely impressed. "The Defense Department will love the applications for signals intelligence, but this goes beyond that." "That's just it," Baum replied. "I'm thinking about publishing a paper on the mathematical framework, nothing classified, of course, just the theoretical underpinnings." Jim nodded, understanding the delicate dance they all performed. At IDA, their work existed in a strange, limbo cutting-edge mathematics that might never see the light of day due to national security concerns. "I think you should," Jim said finally. "The mathematical community would benefit." That evening, driving home in his new Chevrolet Impala along the elm-lined streets of Princeton, Jim reflected on the peculiar constraints of his new environment. The radio played the Beatles' "A Hard Day's Night" as he considered the dual nature of his work, the intellectual thrill of solving nearly impossible problems, coupled with the knowledge that his solutions would disappear into classified folders. His colonial-style house appeared ahead, warm light spilling from the windows. Inside waited the comfort of family and the freedom to be himself, away from security badges and classified compartments. Yet even here, he couldn't discuss the day's work in any meaningful detail. "How was your day?" his wife would ask over dinner. "Interesting," he would reply. "Challenging." It became their ritual, a conversation without content, like so many others in Princeton's academic military complex during those tense Cold War years. Summer 1965. The air conditioning hummed laboriously in the IDA building as Jim stared at a printout of seemingly random data points, intercept records from a Soviet communications system. Outside, the world was changing. President Johnson had just committed the first ground troops to Vietnam. The civil rights movement was gaining momentum, and a countercultural wave was beginning to swell on college campuses. Inside IDA, however, time moved according to different rhythms. The steady progression of mathematical inquiry, the patient accumulation of insight. Jim had been working for weeks on an algorithm designed to separate meaningful signals from background noise, a problem with clear applications for intelligence gathering. The beauty of it, he explained to Baum over coffee in the secure break room, is that we don't need to know what the message actually says. We just need to identify that a message exists within the noise. Baum nodded. Pattern recognition without content analysis, the agency folks will be ecstatic. And it's the pattern that matters, Jim continued, warming to his subject. Once you develop an eye for the underlying structure, you can apply the same principles across different domains. It was a lesson that would stay with him, the idea that mathematics could extract meaning from chaos. That signal could be separated from noise in any complex system if one had the right algorithms and enough data. Jim's reputation at IDEA grew. His clearance level increased, giving him access to more sensitive projects. The pay was excellent, approaching $20,000 annually, a small fortune compared to academic salaries. But the real compensation was intellectual. Few mathematicians ever saw their work applied so directly, so consequentially. Yet something was stirring beneath the surface of Jim's carefully ordered world. The reports from Vietnam troubled him. The nightly news showed an escalating conflict with unclear objectives and mounting casualties. At Princeton University, just a short walk from IDA, students were beginning to question America's involvement in what seemed an increasingly dubious war. Jim found himself in an uncomfortable position, using his mathematical gifts to serve a defense establishment whose policies he was beginning to question. November 1967. Rain pelted the windows of Jim's office as he reviewed a particularly elegant solution to a cryptographic problem. 3 years at IDA had honed his skills in pattern recognition and algorithm design to a razor's edge. His work with Baum on hidden Markov models had quietly revolutionized certain aspects of signals intelligence, though the specifics remained classified. A knock at his door interrupted his concentration. "Come in," he called. Dr. Maxwell Richards, IDA's director, entered and closed the door behind him. His expression was grave. "Jim, we need to talk about something." Richards settled into the chair across from Jim's desk. "There's growing concern about the anti-war sentiment at the university. Some of our government partners are worried about potential security risks." Jim leaned back in his chair. "I'm not sure I follow." Several IDA employees were spotted at a protest last week. None of our cleared personnel, thankfully, but it raises questions. Richards paused. "Where do you stand on Vietnam, Jim?" "Off the record." The question hung in the air like smoke. Jim chose his words carefully. "I have concerns about our current strategy, but I keep my work and my politics separate." Richards nodded, seemingly satisfied. "That's the right approach. Just be cautious about public statements. Your clearance makes you a particular case." After Richards left, Jim stood by the window, watching rain streak across the glass. The conversation had clarified something for him. The invisible constraints that came with his position, the tacit expectation of not just confidentiality, but conformity. That evening, he attended a faculty dinner at Princeton University. The conversation inevitably turned to the war. A history professor was particularly vocal about what he called the moral bankruptcy of Johnson's escalation. Jim listened more than he spoke, aware of the delicate position he occupied, a mathematician with top-secret clearance, privy to information others weren't, yet increasingly troubled by the very policies his work supported. Later that night, unable to sleep, he sat in his study with a legal pad, drafting a letter, not to a classified agency or a mathematical journal, but to the New York Times. He wrote carefully, focusing on his concerns as a citizen rather than as a defense researcher. When he finished, he set the pad aside, not yet ready to take the step that would irrevocably change his professional trajectory. January 1968. The Tet Offensive was about to shatter American confidence in Vietnam, though no one yet knew it. Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy still lived. The cultural divide in America was widening into a chasm. Jim sat in a classified briefing, listening to a Defense Department official discuss the application of their algorithms to battlefield communications in Southeast Asia. The mathematics was sound elegant even, but the purpose had begun to feel hollow. After the meeting, he found Baum in the hallway. "Got time for coffee?" They walked to a small cafe off campus, one of the few places they could speak freely, though even there they were careful to discuss only unclassified matters. "I'm thinking about signing a public letter opposing the war," Jim said after they'd settled at a corner table. Baum's eyebrows rose above his glasses. "That would be problematic, for your clearance, I mean." "I know. Is it worth it? The work we're doing is fascinating," Jim interrupted. "Intellectually satisfying. Well compensated. But at some point, Len, you have to ask what it's in service to." Baum stirred his coffee thoughtfully. "You know I share some of your concerns, but there are ways to express them that don't jeopardize everything." Jim nodded. "I've been thinking about that. What if our next paper, the one on statistical pattern recognition, had applications beyond defense, medical diagnostics perhaps, or economic modeling? Diversifying our intellectual portfolio?" Baum smiled. "I like it." They spent the rest of the afternoon sketching ideas, exploring how their work on hidden patterns could extend beyond cryptography and signals intelligence. It was the beginning of a conceptual pivot that would eventually bear fruit far from the secured rooms of IDA. February 1968. Jim stared at the morning edition of the New York Times spread across his kitchen table. There, in the opinion section, was the letter, a measured but unequivocal statement opposing the Vietnam War, signed by numerous academics and intellectuals. His name among them. He had made his choice. The letter had gone public, and there was no taking it back. The phone rang. It was Richard's. "I need you to come in immediately," the director said, his voice taut. Jim drove to IDA through a light snowfall, the campus looking postcard perfect despite the tension awaiting him. At the security checkpoint, the guard gave him a strange look but waved him through. Richards was waiting in his office, a copy of the Times on his desk. "Explain this," he said without preamble. "It's exactly what it appears to be," Jim replied, "a statement of conscience. You understand the position this puts us in with our sponsors at Defense?" Jim nodded. "I do." "And you made this choice anyway. It wasn't a question. Some principles transcend institutional loyalty." Richards looked at him for a long moment. "Turn in your badge to security on your way out. Your clearance is revoked, effective immediately. We'll send your personal items to your home address." Just like that, it was over. 3 years of cutting-edge work, significant income, and intellectual stimulation, gone in a single meeting. Jim walked through the IDA building one last time, aware of colleagues watching from doorways, some sympathetic, others bewildered. At the security desk, he surrendered his badge without comment. Outside, snow continued to fall, transforming the campus into something both familiar and strange. His car sat in the parking lot, already gathering a thin white blanket. Before driving away, he stood for a moment, looking back at the red brick building where he had spent so many hours pushing the boundaries of mathematical pattern recognition. He felt neither triumph nor regret, just the clarity that comes with making a difficult choice aligned with one's deepest values. April 1968. Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated. Cities across America smoldered with grief and rage. The national mood was somber, fractured. Jim sat in his study at home, surrounded by books and papers. Since his dismissal from IDA, he had been exploring academic opportunities, reconnecting with the pure mathematics community. His phone had been surprisingly busy. Apparently, his stance had earned him respect in certain quarters. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Baum, their friendship having survived Jim's departure from IDA. "I can't stay long," Baum said as Jim ushered him in, "but I wanted you to know they're using your algorithms. They're working exactly as you designed them." Jim nodded. Good. The math was sound even if the application was problematic. They sat in companionable silence for a moment. Two mathematicians who had ventured into the shadowy world of intelligence work and emerged with different perspectives but mutual respect. "What will you do now?" Baum asked finally. "I've had an offer from Stony Brook, department chair actually. They want to build their mathematics program, particularly in geometry and analysis." "You'd be good at that. Building something, I mean. You have the vision." Jim smiled. "And I've learned a few things about institutions and their constraints." As Baum prepared to leave, he paused. "One more thing. That paper we discussed, applying our statistical methods to other fields, I've been developing it further." "Send me a draft," Jim said. "I'm particularly interested in how these patterns might appear in economic systems." After Baum left, Jim returned to his study. On his desk lay offers from several universities, each presenting different opportunities. The salary wouldn't match IDA, but there was a freedom that no security clearance could provide. The freedom to follow his intellectual curiosity wherever it led, to speak his mind without fear of institutional reprisal. He had paid a price for his principles, but in doing so he had discovered something valuable, the power of intellectual autonomy. It was a lesson he would carry forward into the next chapter of his life, that true innovation often requires freedom from institutional constraints, that the most valuable patterns sometimes emerge only when one steps back from the immediate problem. As twilight settled over Princeton, Jim began drafting his acceptance letter to Stony Brook University. Outside, America continued its turbulent journey through 1968, but within his study, a new path was taking shape, one that would eventually lead him from the quiet halls of academia to the creation of one of the most successful quantitative investment firms in history. But that was still to come. For now, there was just a mathematician at his desk, applying the lessons of pattern recognition to the next phase of his remarkable journey. The concrete edifice of Stony Brook University rose from the windswept Long Island landscape like a modernist vision, stark, utilitarian, and decidedly unfinished. In 1968, as Jim Simons first walked the campus as the newly appointed chair of the mathematics department, the half-built structures seemed an apt metaphor for his mission, to construct something of substance where only potential existed. The morning air carried a briny hint of the sound as Simons, then 30, navigated between construction sites and brutalist buildings. His tweed jacket set him apart from the students, many wearing army surplus jackets or tie-dyed shirts, visual reminders of the Cultural Revolution happening beyond the campus boundaries. Inside his sparse office, Simons contemplated the chalkboard where geometric formulas competed for space. He had accepted this position with a singular vision: to transform Stony Brook's mathematics department from a respectable but unremarkable program into a world-class center for geometry and topology. "You're either ambitious or insane," remarked Professor Detlef Grummel, one of Simons's first recruits, watching him sketch out expansion plans. The German geometer had been lured from Bonn with promises of intellectual freedom and minimal teaching loads. "Perhaps both," Simons replied with his characteristic half-smile. "But I believe we can build something extraordinary here." What Simons wouldn't say aloud was that he saw mathematics departments as ecosystems, not hierarchies but networks of brilliance that, when properly cultivated, could produce results greater than the sum of individual talents. "I need your help recruiting," Simons told Grummel. "Who's the best differential geometer you know who might be persuaded to join us?" "Beyond Chern? Impossible to get him. He's Berkeley's crown jewel." "For now," Simons said quietly, already calculating the variables that might someday bring his former mentor into his orbit. By winter of that first year, as student protests against the Vietnam War echoed across campus, Simons methodically built his department. Each new hire was selected not just for individual brilliance, but for how they might catalyze others. He recruited Jeff Cheeger from Michigan, Claude Lebrun from Oxford, and a constellation of rising stars who might have chosen more prestigious institutions, but were drawn by the promise of what Stony Brook could become. In faculty meetings, Simons demonstrated a leadership style that colleagues found both disarming and effective. Where other department chairs ruled through authority, Simons led through collaboration. He listened more than he spoke. When he disagreed, he did so by asking questions that revealed flaws in reasoning rather than by imposing his will. The faculty senate meeting was brutal today, complained one professor after a particularly contentious campus-wide gathering in 1969, where anti-war sentiments had boiled over into shouting matches. Politics is inevitable, Simons responded, gazing out his window at students gathered around a makeshift stage where someone was reading poetry through a megaphone. But mathematics stands apart. 2 + 2 = 4, regardless of who occupies the White House. This detachment wasn't political apathy, but strategic focus. While other departments became battlegrounds of ideology, Simons insulated mathematics, creating a sanctuary where equations and proofs remained the only currency that mattered. By 1970, as inflation began its upward climb and the economic mood of the country darkened, Simons was already establishing his department as a formidable presence in differential geometry. The seminars he organized attracted visitors from Princeton, Harvard, and Berkeley. The common room, once empty most afternoons, now hummed with multilingual conversations about manifolds and gauge theories, accompanied by the perpetual percolation of overbrewed coffee. In his more private moments, however, Simons was developing another interest. The newspapers that accumulated on his desk weren't just for global awareness. He studied the financial pages with increasing attention. The abandonment of the gold standard in 1971 had created new volatilities in currency markets, patterns that seemed to Simons not entirely random. "Fascinating, isn't it?" he remarked to a colleague who caught him studying exchange rate tables. "The dollar against the Deutschmark, there's structure in the fluctuations." "I didn't take you for a currency speculator, Jim," the colleague said with surprise. "Not speculating, just observing patterns. Mathematics is everywhere, even in money." These early explorations into financial markets were modest: small positions in currencies, occasional trades in soybean futures. The results were unspectacular: break-even some months, small profits in others. But Simons approached these market experiments with the same methodical curiosity he brought to mathematics, keeping detailed notes on what worked and what failed. In his classroom, Simons was respected rather than beloved. His lectures weren't performances but invitations to thought. He wrote equations with a mathematician's economical hand, each symbol precisely placed, each step logically connected to the next. "Mathematics doesn't require theatrics," he told a teaching assistant who suggested he might make his lectures more engaging. "The elegance of the proof is enough." By 1972, as the country became absorbed in the Watergate scandal, Simons was accomplishing what many had considered impossible. Stony Brook's mathematics department was gaining national recognition. The quality of graduate students applying to the program improved dramatically. Young faculty regularly received prestigious grants and invitations to speak at international conferences. It was during this period that Simons intensified his collaboration with Xing Chen, the distinguished Chinese-American mathematician who had once been his mentor. Though Chen remained at Berkeley, he made extended visits to Stony Brook, and Simons traveled frequently to California. Their collaboration culminated in a seminar room at Stony Brook in the winter of 1973, with snow falling steadily outside the windows. The two mathematicians worked in near silence for hours, Simons occasionally rising to write on the blackboard, Chen making notes in a small, leather-bound notebook. "I think we have something significant here," Chen finally said, studying a particular equation they had derived. Simons nodded, his expression calm but his eyes animated with the particular intensity that colleagues recognized as excitement. This could bridge topology and theoretical physics in ways nobody has explored. What they were developing would later be known as Chern-Simons theory, a mathematical framework that defined topological invariance with profound applications across multiple fields. The paper they published in 1974 was deceptively modest in presentation, but revolutionary in content. During this same period, the Arab oil embargo sent gasoline prices soaring. As faculty complained about fuel shortages and the new 55 mph speed limit, Simons observed the economic ripple effects with analytical detachment. "The markets are signaling information," he remarked to a colleague as they watched news footage of cars lined up at gas stations. "The question is whether we can decode that information systematically." His personal experiments in the commodity markets continued, neither dramatically successful nor discouraging enough to abandon. But these financial side projects remained private, shared only with a few trusted colleagues who shared his curiosity about applying mathematics to markets. What Simons was building at Stony Brook was not just academic excellence, but a template for how talent could be organized for maximum effect. He recruited not just for individual brilliance, but for complementary strengths. He created an environment where collaboration was valued over competition, where ideas flowed freely, and where egos were subordinated to collective achievement. "The department feels different than any place I've been," remarked a visiting professor from Cambridge. "There's an unusual lack of territoriality." "Mathematics isn't a zero-sum game," Simons replied. "Someone else's breakthrough doesn't diminish your own. It extends the frontier for all of us." By 1974, as the Chern-Simons paper made its way through academic circles, generating excitement among both mathematicians and theoretical physicists, Simons had accomplished his primary mission. Stony Brook's mathematics department now stood among the top geometry programs in the country, mentioned alongside Princeton and Berkeley. The department's weekly seminar had become a must-attend event, drawing visitors from across the eastern seaboard. The common room, now equipped with better coffee and comfortable chairs, salvaged from university surplus, had become an intellectual salon where informal conversations often sparked new collaborations. On a crisp autumn evening in 1974, Simons stood at his office window, watching students cross the quad below. The campus had matured since his arrival. Trees were taller, paths more defined, buildings completed. Similarly, his department had evolved from potential to realization. A knock at the door interrupted his reflection. It was one of his younger faculty members, excited about a new approach to a problem they had been discussing. "I think I've found a different angle on the gauge invariance question," the young mathematician said, already sketching diagrams on Simons's blackboard. Simons listened intently, asking occasional questions that gently steered the conversation. This was where he found his greatest satisfaction, not in asserting his own ideas, but in creating the conditions for others to achieve breakthroughs. Later that evening, alone in his office with financial pages spread across his desk, Simons contemplated the parallel tracks of his interests. The mathematical work brought intellectual fulfillment and professional recognition. His financial explorations were still embryonic, neither consistently profitable nor clearly futile. Yet something was crystallizing in his understanding, a realization that mathematics alone, for all its beauty, did not generate the kind of resources that could be reinvested to expand knowledge further. Academic salaries and government grants were limited currencies. Markets, on the other hand, offered the possibility of exponential returns if approached with sufficient rigor. As Simons drove home that night, the headlights of his modest sedan cutting through the darkness of Long Island's northern shore, he considered the architecture of his future. The Stony Brook mathematics department was now secure in its excellence. The Chern-Simons work represented a pinnacle of theoretical achievement. Perhaps there were other mountains to climb, other systems to build, other patterns to discern. The next morning, returning to campus with the rising sun burnishing the concrete facades of the university buildings, Simons carried with him not just the day's lectures and departmental matters, but the first faint outlines of a longer journey, one that would eventually transform both his life and the intersection of mathematics and finance. For now, though, there were classes to teach, seminars to lead, and the continuing work of nurturing a department where ideas flourished and boundaries between mathematical disciplines dissolved. The next generation of geometers and topologists was forming under his guidance, each contributing to the collective project of expanding mathematical knowledge. And if, during quiet moments, Simon sometimes turned his attention to currency tables and commodity prices, searching for patterns in the noise of markets, it remained a private inquiry, a mathematical puzzle separate from his academic identity, but connected to his fundamental belief that the world, in all its apparent chaos, contained structures waiting to be discovered by those with the right tools and perspective. The late afternoon sunlight cast long shadows through the high windows of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. Jim Simons absently ran his finger along the edge of the envelope in his hands, the return address bearing the insignia of the American Mathematical Society. The letter inside confirmed what he'd heard through back channels. The 1976 Veblen Prize in Geometry would be his. He placed the letter on his desk and gazed at the fading light. At 48, he'd reached mathematics' inner sanctum. The Veblen wasn't the Fields Medal, but in the rarefied air of differential geometry, it marked a rival. Bronze medal, $5,000, symbolic, not life-changing. The irony wasn't lost on him. Outside these ivied walls, America was floundering in what the press had taken to calling stagflation. The Dow had briefly touched 1,000 earlier that year before retreating again, the economy lurching like a car with water in its gas tank. Inflation was crushing ordinary Americans, unemployment climbing. Yet here he was, financially stable if not wealthy, department chair salary at Stony Brook around $40,000, plus whatever he'd made dabbling in commodity trades. "Jim, you heading to the reception?" Leonard Baum appeared in the doorway, tall and angular with penetrating eyes behind thick glasses. Baum, his old colleague from IDA days, had pioneered hidden Markov models, statistical tools that could discern patterns buried in apparent randomness. "Just a minute." Jim slid the letter into his jacket pocket. They made it official. "The Veblen, congratulations." Baum's smile was genuine but brief. "More importantly, have you thought more about what we discussed?" The what hung between them, an unspoken possibility. For months, they'd been talking about markets, not as abstract mechanisms, but as generators of patterns. Statistical patterns, hidden patterns, the sort that might yield to the right mathematical tools. "I have," Jim said quietly. "Let's talk after the reception." The Princeton Faculty Club hummed with the genteel conversation of mathematicians, physicists, and economists, their discussions punctuated by the clink of glasses and subdued laughter. Outside, autumn was giving way to winter, leaves skittering across the campus quad. James Axe, another former IDA colleague now at Cornell, cornered Jim by a table of rapidly diminishing hors d'oeuvres. "So our cryptographer becomes a geometer, becomes a trader?" Axe's voice carried a hint of good-natured skepticism. "What's next, Jim? Politics." "Not trader." "Researcher," Jim corrected, sipping his scotch. "And no, definitely not politics. Have you seen what's happening in Washington? Ford's approval ratings are in the basement, and Carter's talking about restoring trust in government. Good luck with that after Watergate. The markets, though." "Why?" Axe pressed. Jim considered the question. "Because they're complex adaptive systems generating huge amounts of data. Because patterns exist that aren't random but look random to most observers. Because," he lowered his voice, "because there's something there, James. Something that can be extracted with the right tools." Later, in a corner of the club where the noise provided cover, Jim and Baum sketched formulas on napkins. Hidden states. Transition probabilities. The architecture of a system that might predict currency movements. "We'd need computational power," Baum said. "And clean data," Jim added. "And capital," they both acknowledged. By midnight, the outline of monometrics existed on those napkins, soon to be destroyed. The company name itself was a quiet joke, Moneymetrics, the measurement of money flows. Stony Brook, 1978. Jim's office overlooked the brutalist concrete sprawl of the mathematics building. Snow dusted the campus, students hurrying between buildings with collars turned up against the bitter Long Island wind. Inside, a space heater fought a losing battle against the drafts. "I found someone," Barbara, his secretary, announced, placing a stack of papers on his desk. "The computer scientist you asked about. Frazier lives on the North Shore, worked at Bell Labs on data compression. Might be interested in our project." Jim nodded his thanks. After 2 years of preparation, Monometrics was finally operational. A small office in Port Jefferson, a modest bank of computers, and a founding team that included Baum, a few trusted mathematicians, and now, hopefully, someone who could handle the computing infrastructure. Later that evening, Jim drove his Volvo through the sleet to the Monometrics office. The small suite overlooked the harbor, boats shrouded in winter covers. Inside, Baum was hunched over printouts, cigarette smoke wreathing his head. "Deutsche Marks moving against us," he said, without looking up. Jim hung his coat and poured coffee from a machine that produced something closer to tar. "How bad?" 6% down since Monday. The model didn't catch the reversal. Baum pushed his glasses up. "We need to recalibrate the parameters." This had become a familiar rhythm over the past 6 months. Initial optimism, a seemingly promising model, early trades with modest gains, then reversals that erased profits. They were running in place, not losing catastrophically, but not winning either. Breaking even was a form of slow death in a business with overhead. "It's not the parameters," Jim said quietly, settling into a chair. "It's the model itself. We're capturing part of the pattern, but not enough of it. We need more dimensions." "More factors," Baum looked up. "More models, different classes of models working in concert," Jim clarified. "No single statistical method is going to be robust across all market conditions. We need ensemble approaches." Baum's expression shifted from fatigue to intrigue. "Like a voting system?" "Exactly. Models that specialize in different regimes, with a meta layer that decides which ones to trust under current conditions." Jim picked up a marker and began sketching on the whiteboard. "But that requires more people, more capital, more capital." "And more time," Baum finished. "Which brings us to the immediate problem." The immediate problem was that Monometrics was consuming capital without generating returns. By mid-1979, the verdict would be clear: the first attempt had failed. Rain slashed against the windows of the waterfront restaurant in Port Jefferson. The harbor, usually picturesque, disappeared into sheets of gray. Inside, over a lunch neither man was eating, Jim and Baum faced the end of Monometrics. "So, that's it," Baum said, folding his napkin with mathematical precision. "We close shop." Jim nodded, his expression inscrutable. "We learned what doesn't work. That's valuable. Cold comfort when you're burning cash." "True." Jim watched raindrops race down the window, merging and splitting in chaotic patterns. "But consider what we actually learned. First, single model approaches are fragile. They work until they don't, usually when the market regime changes. Second, we need better data hygiene, garbage in, garbage out. Third, computational power matters more than we thought. And fourth," Baum added with a rueful smile, "never publish your methods." Jim raised an eyebrow. "That paper I gave at the Princeton seminar. Within weeks, the pattern we'd found in T-bill futures vanished. Too many smart people watching the same moves." That observation crystallized something Jim had been turning over since his IDA days. Academia thrived on open publication, markets rewarded secrecy. The incentives were fundamentally opposed. "So, what now?" Baum asked. Jim sipped his coffee, now cold. "I go back to Stony Brook, think, rebuild. The core thesis isn't wrong. There are inefficiencies in how markets process information, but our approach was incomplete." "And the next venture won't be called Monometrics," Baum surmised. "No," Jim said with the first real smile of the day. "I'm thinking Renaissance, a rebirth of the approach." Winter again, this time 1979. The world seemed to be unraveling. Americans held hostage in Iran, gas lines forming again, Carter on television in a cardigan talking about a crisis of confidence. Inside Jim's modest home in Setauket, a fire crackled in the hearth as he reviewed notes from the monometrics post-mortem. The phone rang. It was nearly midnight. "Jim Simons," he answered. "It's Frazier. I've been thinking about our conversation from last month." Jim reached for a notepad. "Go on." "You were right about the data problem. The signal-to-noise ratio in market data is terrible. But what if we treat it like a corruption problem? Like decoding a message that's been partially garbled in transmission?" Jim sat up straighter, the failure of monometrics receding as a new possibility formed. Similar to what we did at IDA, extracting patterns from seeming randomness. Exactly. But we need better tools, more computing power, and a different organizational approach. Not a conventional trading firm. More like a research lab with a trading arm. The conversation continued past 2 a.m., diagrams and equations accumulating in Jim's notepad. When he finally hung up, he didn't go to bed. Instead, he stood at the window, watching snow begin to fall in the glow of the street lamp. Monometrics had been a necessary failure. Like a mathematician working through false starts before finding the elegant proof, he'd needed to see the wrong path to recognize the right one. The year was ending in economic and geopolitical uncertainty, but for Jim Simons, clarity was emerging from chaos. He opened a drawer in his desk and withdrew a single sheet of paper. At the top he wrote, "Renaissance Technologies, First Principles." Below, he began listing the lessons from monometrics, not as failures, but as guideposts. 1. Diversify models, not just positions. 2. Secrecy is non-negotiable. 3. Hire scientists, not traders. 4. Data integrity above all else. 5. Test. Ruthlessly kill failed hypotheses quickly. Outside, the snow fell heavier, transforming the landscape. The 1970s were ending in malaise and uncertainty. But in this quiet moment, Jim Simons was mapping the architecture of what would become the most successful quantitative trading firm in history, built not on the ashes of monometrics, but on its essential lessons. The Veblen Prize had recognized his contributions to mathematics, but his greatest work still lay ahead, not in theorems and proofs, but in the application of mathematical principles to the noisy, chaotic world of markets. The hard lessons of the late 1970s would become the foundation of an empire. The October rain traced delicate rivulets down the windows of the nondescript office building in East Setauket, Long Island. Jim Simons watched the drops merge and separate in patterns that seemed both random and oddly predictable, much like the market data scrolling across his terminal. The year was 1982, and Renaissance Technologies had just been formally christened from the remnants of Limroy. The location, 30 miles from Wall Street's frenetic trading floors, was no accident. Jim had deliberately chosen this quiet corner of Long Island as his stronghold, close enough to New York to access its resources, far enough to avoid its groupthink. "The market's up nearly 100 points since August," remarked James Axe, the algebraic number theorist Jim had recruited from Cornell. "Reagan's tax cuts seem to be having their effect." Jim nodded absently, his mind elsewhere. The rally matters less than the patterns underneath it. He tapped his pencil against a yellow legal pad covered in equations. Volcker's got inflation in a chokehold, but the movements in the bond futures are telling a more complex story. The office hummed with the sound of DEC minicomputers, a significant investment for a fledgling operation, but essential for the vision Jim was slowly articulating. In one corner, a researcher meticulously fed punch cards containing futures data into a reader. Most firms on Wall Street were still trading by feel, by rumor, by phone calls to brokers. Renaissance was building something different. "How's the currency model looking?" Jim asked, turning to Henry, a physicist they'd pulled from Stony Brook's faculty. "Mixed results. We're seeing strong signals in the Deutsche Mark dollar pair, but the positions are whipsawing us in the yen." Henry pushed his glasses up. "I think we need more data points before I'd trust it with serious money." Jim nodded, unperturbed by the uncertainty. The erratic returns were the price of experimentation. In the first months of 1982, They'd seen weeks of promising gains followed by devastating drawdowns. But something was taking shape in the noise, something most traders couldn't see. "I want every futures contract digitized," Jim said. "Not just prices. Volumes, open interest, everything. Before anyone else has it in machine-readable form." Outside, the afternoon light was fading early as autumn deepened on Long Island. The fluorescent office lighting gave everything a stark, clinical quality, appropriate for what was essentially becoming a research laboratory for finance. Later that evening, Jim drove his modestly expensive BMW concession to success, but not ostentation, through the quiet streets to meet a potential recruit at a nearby restaurant. The Reagan recession had left its mark even on affluent Suffolk County. Several storefronts were empty, with "for lease" signs hanging in windows. Unemployment remained stubbornly high nationwide, though Wall Street had begun its long detachment from Main Street's fortunes. Inside the restaurant, Jim spotted his dinner companion, a computer scientist from MIT with expertise in pattern recognition. The recruitment pitch wouldn't mention compensation packages or corner offices. It would begin with a single question. "Who's the smartest person you know?" Jim asked, after initial pleasantries. The scientist looked momentarily confused, then thoughtful. "Probably Leonard. He's doing computational linguistics at IBM's research lab. Why?" "I might want to talk to him too," Jim said with a slight smile. "But first, let me tell you what we're building." Jim described not a hedge fund, but an intellectual puzzle, a system to detect statistical regularities in market behavior that others couldn't see. The scientist's eyes lit up with the same intensity Jim had once seen in seminar rooms at Princeton and Stony Brook. "We won't be reading earnings reports or interviewing management," Jim explained. "We're looking for signals that are statistically significant, testable, and exploitable in liquid markets only. Nothing where we can't get out quickly if we need to." Over coffee, the conversation shifted to compensation, and here Jim departed from academic norms completely. "Salary matters less than equity," Jim said, drawing a small diagram on a napkin. "We're structuring this so that the researchers own a significant piece of the management company itself. If what we're building works, that's where the real value will accrue." The scientist nodded slowly, grasping that Jim was offering something academic departments never could: ownership in an intellectual enterprise with potentially unlimited upside. By early 1983, the Renaissance offices had expanded to accommodate 12 researchers, mathematicians, physicists, computer scientists, none with traditional Wall Street backgrounds. The culture was forming organically around Jim's quiet insistence on empirical rigor. Hypotheses that couldn't be tested with data died quickly, promising signals were refined and expanded. "We've got a problem with the bond model," Elwyn Berlekamp announced during a morning meeting. The information theorist had joined from Berkeley, bringing expertise in algorithmic decision-making. "It's working too well in backtests." "I don't trust it." Jim raised an eyebrow. "Overfitting?" "Almost certainly. When I segment the data differently, the results fall apart. We need stronger validation methods." In another firm, such an admission might have triggered frustration or blame. At Renaissance, it sparked curiosity. Two researchers immediately began sketching alternative approaches on a whiteboard. Jim watched, saying little, his mathematician's instinct for elegant solutions still guiding his managerial style. The Reagan economy was gathering steam outside their windows. Inflation had fallen below 4%. GDP growth would hit 7% in 1984. On Wall Street, mergers and leveraged buyouts were creating a new financial ecosystem. The culture was shifting. Tom Wolfe had introduced Masters of the Universe into the lexicon, and the first waves of conspicuous consumption were breaking across Manhattan. None of this registered visibly at Renaissance. The East Settleket operation remained deliberately low profile. No press releases announced new funds or strategies. No one appeared on the financial television shows multiplying on cable. When potential investors called, they were politely discouraged. "I got another call from Smith Barney," Jim's assistant mentioned one afternoon. They have a client who heard about your returns from January. Tell them we're not accepting outside capital at this time, Jim replied, his focus remaining on a printout of trading signals. The truth was more complex. The returns were still erratic, promising enough to continue, not consistent enough to market. More importantly, Jim was developing an intuition that secrecy itself was valuable. Every signal they discovered had a half-life. Once others found it, the edge would erode. Privacy wasn't paranoia, it was a business strategy. The team gathered for dinner at Jim's house in late 1983 to celebrate a breakthrough. They had successfully automated the full trading cycle for currency futures, from signal generation to execution, cutting human intervention to a minimum. The results for November had been the best since inception. Jim's home reflected his peculiar blend of mathematical austerity and aesthetic appreciation. Modern furniture with clean lines shared space with carefully chosen art pieces. Bach played softly in the background, the Goldberg variations, mathematical in their precision. To systematic trading, Jim raised a glass of Bordeaux as the team settled around his dining table. May our signals stay strong and our execution costs fall. There was gentle laughter, the inside humor of quantitative minds finding poetry in market microstructure. I've been thinking about our computing infrastructure, said Peter Brown, one of the newer hires with a background in computer science. We're hitting the limits of what the DEC systems can process overnight. If we're going to add more data feeds, we'll need something more powerful. Jim nodded thoughtfully. Work up some specifications. Whatever we need, we'll build or buy. The data advantage is fundamental to what we're doing. The conversation meandered through technical challenges and potential research directions. Unlike the raucous trader dinners happening in Manhattan steakhouses, all cocaine energy and status displays, this gathering had the focused intensity of scientists closing in on a discovery. As the evening wound down, James Axe pulled Jim aside. I've been modeling our current approach, he said quietly. If the signals maintain their fidelity and we can execute cleanly, the strategy should scale significantly. Have you thought about what happens if this actually works as well as we think it might? Jim gazed out the window at the Long Island darkness, considering the question with characteristic thoroughness. If it works, he said finally, we'll face more complex decisions than we do now. Scale versus signal decay. Client capital versus control. But those are good problems to have. Axe nodded. The ownership structure you've set up, it could create extraordinary wealth if the models perform. For all of us, Jim affirmed. That's the design. But the wealth is secondary to solving the puzzle. Markets are inefficient in subtle, exploitable ways that most humans can't perceive. Finding those inefficiencies, that's the real achievement. By early 1984, Renaissance had refined its core principles into something approaching a philosophy. No fundamental analysis. Price and volume contained all necessary information. Only liquid instruments. Positions that could be exited quickly if models changed their signals. And perhaps most importantly, no discretionary overrides. The system's decisions were final, even when they seemed counterintuitive to human judgment. The computing infrastructure had expanded to fill a dedicated room, humming with the constant processing of market data. Each night, the machines would analyze patterns, generate signals, and prepare trading instructions for the following day. The human researchers increasingly devoted themselves to improving the models rather than making individual trading decisions. Jim sat alone in his office one evening, reviewing performance metrics as winter darkness settled early over Long Island. The year had brought more consistency, still not enough to confidently market to outside investors, but enough to validate the approach. More importantly, the infrastructure they'd built was accumulating advantages that would be difficult for others to replicate. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. Jim, it's Leonard, a former IDA colleague who now ran quantitative research at a major bank. I heard through the grapevine you're doing something interesting out there in Settlegate. Jim smiled faintly. Just some applied mathematics, nothing revolutionary. That's not what I hear. Word is, You're building a black box that's starting to beat the market consistently. Rumors are generally exaggerated, Jim replied, his voice giving away nothing. Maybe so. Listen, we're expanding our quant desk. The budget is substantial. If you ever want to bring your team and your models in-house, we should talk numbers. Jim gazed at the equations scattered across his desk, the early scaffolding of what would eventually become the most successful trading system in history. I appreciate the interest, Leonard, but we're committed to our independence. What we're building needs space to evolve without institutional constraints. After hanging up, Jim returned to the performance data with renewed focus. The call had clarified something important. Renaissance was creating value that others could already sense, even without seeing the details. The longer they could work in obscurity, refining their approach while others remained ignorant, the stronger their advantage would become. Outside, a cold rain began to fall on East Setauket. Inside Renaissance Technologies, the computers continued their relentless analysis, finding patterns in the noise, just as Jim Simons had always done, first in mathematics, now in markets. The scaffold was rising, beam by invisible beam, for a wealth generation machine unlike any Wall Street had ever seen. The morning light broke through the blinds of Jim Simons' East Setauket office, illuminating swirls of chalk dust that hovered like galaxies in the air. Outside, Long Island Sound stretched toward the horizon, its waters reflecting the golden hues of a mid-1980s autumn. The mathematics professor turned investor stood at his blackboard, chalk in hand, staring at equations that most on Wall Street wouldn't recognize, much less comprehend. The trend-following signal broke down again yesterday, he murmured, more to himself than to Elwyn Berlekamp, who sat in a leather chair nearby, fingers steepled beneath his chin. Pattern recognition in noise, Berlekamp replied. It's what we did at IDA, except the markets are noisier than any cryptographic system I've ever seen. Berlekamp, whom Jim had recruited from Berkeley in 1985, brought a mathematician's precision to Renaissance Technologies. An information theorist with a background in game theory, he viewed markets not as an ecosystem of human decisions, but as a transmission system corrupted by noise. The real alpha isn't in following trends everyone can see, Berlekamp continued. It's in extracting the signal others miss. Jim nodded, wiping chalk from his fingers. At 47, his beard was fuller now, his hair slightly thinned, but his eyes retained their penetrating intensity. Renaissance Technologies occupied a nondescript building far from the gleaming towers of Manhattan. The distance was deliberate. While Wall Street brokers shouted across trading floors in pinstripe suits and suspenders, Jim's team worked in comfortable sweaters, surrounded by whiteboards and computer terminals. We need more minds like yours, Jim said. People who see patterns mathematically, not financially. By early 1987, Jim had convinced James Axe to join the team. Axe, an algebraic geometer with a brilliant if mercurial temperament, completed a triumvirate that would reshape Renaissance's approach. The three men, Simons, Berlekamp, and Axe, formed a research nucleus unlike anything else in finance, pure mathematicians applying abstract theory to market behavior. Their Friday research meetings became legend within the firm. Phones were forbidden. Egos checked at the door. Ideas lived or died by their mathematical merit alone. Show me why this works, Jim would demand when presented with a new trading signal. Not anecdotally. Prove it statistically across multiple time frames. The culture crystallized around this empiricism. Renaissance didn't hire MBA graduates or seasoned traders. They sought PhDs in mathematics, physics, and computer science, people who had never developed the biases of traditional finance. Interview candidates faced puzzle tests that evaluated raw problem-solving ability. Those who had excelled in the Putnam competition, the prestigious undergraduate mathematics examination, received special attention. We don't want people who think they understand markets, Jim explained to a new recruit on a cool spring morning in 1987. We want people who understand that they don't understand markets. You need to add some text for me to talk. The firm grew methodically through the first half of 1987. Their computer systems, cutting edge for the time-processed data that most investors ignored, tick-by-tick price movements. Subtle correlations between seemingly unrelated securities, microstructure patterns in order flow. Where others saw random walks, Renaissance detected faint but persistent signals. Then came October 19, 1987. Jim stood in the trading room, watching monitors flash red as markets around the world collapsed. The Dow Jones Industrial Average plummeted 22.6% in a single session, the largest one-day percentage drop in history. Renaissance's trend following strategies, which had performed admirably in the bull market, were now bleeding capital at an alarming rate. The models are all breaking down, one researcher said, voice tight with concern. Every trend signal is reversing simultaneously. Jim's expression remained calm, but those who knew him well could see the tension in his shoulders. By day's end, Renaissance had suffered a devastating blow, a drawdown approaching 30% of their assets under management. In the days that followed, redemption notices arrived from nervous investors. The firm's very survival hung in the balance. 3 nights after Black Monday, Jim sat alone in his office, the glow of a single lamp illuminating stacks of printouts and performance data. The phone rang, Berlekamp calling from his home. "Jim, we need to completely rethink our approach," Berlekamp said without preamble. "Single strategy risk is killing us." "I've been looking at the same data," Jim replied. "Trend following worked until it didn't. But what if we had multiple, uncorrelated strategies operating simultaneously?" "An ensemble model," Berlekamp said, the excitement evident in his voice. "No single strategy dominates. Mean reversion could balance trend following. Statistical arbitrage could offset both." "Exactly," Jim said, energy returning to his voice. "We build dozens, eventually hundreds of small, statistically sound models, each capturing a different market inefficiency." This conversation marked Renaissance's second major inflection point. The first had been its founding. The second was this phoenix-like rebirth from the ashes of the 1987 crash. Through the winter of 1987 and into 1988, Renaissance underwent a radical transformation. Jim gathered his team, now expanded to include computer scientists and statistical physicists, and outlined a new mandate: no single strategy risk, no discretionary overrides, complete fealty to the system. "From now on, we trade what the models tell us to trade," he instructed. "No exceptions, no matter how counterintuitive it seems. If a human can override the system, human bias will eventually corrupt it." While Wall Street returned to its bullish ways, the Dow recovering its losses by early 1989, Renaissance worked in monastic isolation. New models emerged, mean reversion strategies that capitalized on temporary price dislocations, statistical arbitrage techniques that identified mispriced pairs of securities, market microstructure models that detected patterns in liquidity provision. Each model underwent rigorous statistical validation. If it couldn't demonstrate significance across multiple time periods and market regimes, it was discarded. The survivors were weighted according to their expected contribution to the portfolio, creating a symphony of algorithms where no single instrument could dominate the performance. In early 1988, Renaissance launched a new fund vehicle to embody this approach, Medallion, named after the prestigious mathematics prizes Fields, Abel, that Jim and his colleagues admired. The initial assets were modest, approximately $30 million, drawn from both external investors and the personal capital of Renaissance employees. Jim instituted a strict policy of secrecy. All employees signed ironclad non-disclosure agreements. Discussion of trading strategies outside the office was forbidden. Even spouses weren't privy to the details of Renaissance's methods. "Our intellectual property is all we have," Jim explained to the team during a meeting in the spring of 1988. "Banks have capital, brokers have clients, we have our research. The moment our methods become known, they lose their edge." The culture of discretion extended to Renaissance's physical presence. While competitors emblazoned their names on Manhattan skyscrapers, Renaissance remained in its unassuming Long Island headquarters. Visitors were rare and carefully screened. The parking lot contained modest vehicles. The outward displays of wealth common on Wall Street were discouraged. By late 1988, early signs indicated that the Medallion approach was working. The fund posted solid returns while maintaining remarkably low correlation to major market indices. But it was 1989 that provided true validation. As the Berlin Wall fell and the Cold War thawed, Medallion generated returns that approached 50% after fees, an almost unheard-of performance, especially considering the risk-adjusted metrics. The system is robust, Berlekamp noted during a quarterly review meeting in December 1989. We've traded through multiple market environments now, the crash aftermath, the savings and loan crisis, the junk bond collapse, and the models have adapted to each. Jim nodded, satisfied but not complacent. This is just the beginning, he said quietly. We've proven the concept, but we need to keep refining. More data, more computing power, more signals. The mood at Renaissance's holiday gathering that year was cautiously optimistic. In a rented room at a local restaurant, nothing ostentatious, Jim raised a glass to his assembled team of mathematicians, physicists, and programmers. To the paradox that is Renaissance, he said, we succeed in finance precisely because we're not financial people. We succeed in prediction by accepting that markets are largely unpredictable. And we built a systematic approach by first admitting how little we actually know. As 1989 drew to a close, Jim stood at his office window watching snow fall on the Sound. The decade had taken Renaissance from a struggling futures trading operation to the cusp of something revolutionary. Medallion was still small, invisible to most of Wall Street, but its performance suggested something profound, that mathematics, when rigorously applied with sufficient data and computing power, could decode patterns in market behavior that human traders could never consistently discern. The true testament to Jim's vision wasn't just the returns, impressive though they were. It was the creation of a sustainable research ecosystem that could continuously evolve. While other quantitative funds relied on a handful of strategies or the brilliance of a few star traders, Renaissance was building an ever-expanding library of models, a system that was greater than any individual contribution. Jim turned from the window and returned to his desk. On it lay the resumes of several promising candidates, all PhDs, none with financial experience. Tomorrow would bring interviews, more model testing, the endless pursuit of statistical edge. For now, though, he allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The system worked. Not perfectly, not without risk, but with a consistency that vindicated years of effort. Outside, beyond the snow-covered grounds of Renaissance Technologies, Wall Street continued its frenzied dance of bonuses and buyouts, of power ties and power lunches. Inside, Jim Simons and his band of academic outsiders had created something entirely different, a mathematical approach to markets that would, in time, produce returns so consistent and so extraordinary that they would defy conventional explanation. But that story was still being written, one equation at a time, in the quiet rooms of East Setauket, far from the spotlight, exactly as Jim preferred. The amber glow of twilight washed across the harbor as Jim Simons stood at the edge of Long Island Sound, watching the gentle roll of waves against the rocky shoreline. The air carried the crisp bite of early autumn, the kind that promised change. 1990 had brought exactly that, change of a magnitude few on Wall Street could comprehend, let alone replicate. Jim tugged his cardigan closer, a simple gesture belying the complexity of the man. Behind wire-rimmed glasses, his eyes reflected calculations perpetually running in the background of his consciousness, like the computers that hummed day and night in Renaissance's offices a few miles away. The Medallion Fund had climbed roughly 80% this year, a number that would have seemed fantastical if not for the quiet certainty of mathematics that underpinned it. "Thought I'd find you here," came a familiar voice. Elwyn Berlekamp approached along the pebbled shore, hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket. "Markets closed. Computers are doing their work. Yet here you are, still thinking." Jim smiled, the lines around his eyes crinkling. "The market never really closes, not in here." He tapped his temple. "Not for us." The two men stood in companionable silence. They didn't need to discuss the day's trades or the algorithms that had executed them with millisecond precision. The system they'd built together, refined with James Aikes and their small team of mathematicians and scientists, had transcended the need for daily human intervention. "We're doing something different, Elwin," Jim said finally. "Something that Wall Street doesn't understand yet." "And we prefer to keep it that way," Burlekamp replied. The Cold War had officially ended the previous year, but at Renaissance Technologies, a different kind of secrecy persisted, not out of paranoia, but pragmatism. Their edge existed in the shadows, in the patterns others couldn't see or refused to acknowledge. As the Soviet Union prepared for its final dissolution in the coming year, Renaissance was building its own empire of algorithms and data. In the conference room of Renaissance's East Setauket headquarters, the midday sun filtered through blinds onto a table covered with printouts and half-empty coffee mugs. It was early 1992, and the economic recovery was just beginning to take hold across America. The Gulf War's end had stabilized oil prices, interest rates were declining, but uncertainty remained the market's only constant. Jim stood before a whiteboard covered with equations, speaking to a small group of PhDs, physicists, mathematicians, computer scientists, the kind of talent Wall Street typically ignored in favor of MBAs and traders with the right connections. "What we're seeing," Jim said, tapping the chart showing Medallion's performance through the recession, "is confirmation that our edge isn't just luck. It's durable." He paused, blue eyes scanning the room. "The question becomes, what do we do with this knowledge?" Peter Brown, who had joined from IBM, leaned forward. "The logical conclusion would be to scale up, raise more capital. The models could handle it." Jim nodded, acknowledging the conventional wisdom. "That's what everyone on Wall Street would do, but I'm increasingly convinced it would be a mistake. Because capacity constraints would dilute returns," offered Robert Mercer, his voice soft but precise. "Exactly. The signals we're harvesting, they're delicate, subtle. Push too much money through them." Jim made a crushing motion with his hands. The conversation continued as they debated the merits of growth versus performance. Outside their windows, the traditional financial world was still recovering from the junk bond collapse, Drexel Burnham Lambert's bankruptcy, and the savings and loan crisis. But inside Renaissance's walls, a different economic reality was taking shape, one where mathematics trumped market sentiment, where patterns in the noise yielded consistent profits regardless of whether the broader indices rose or fell. The decision crystallized in 1993 during a rare family dinner at Jim's North Shore home. Barbara, his wife, placed a bowl of pasta on the dining table as their children traded stories about college and their early professional lives. These moments of normalcy were precious in a life increasingly defined by the extraordinary. "I've decided to close Medallion to outside investors," Jim announced, surprising even Barbara, who paused with the serving spoon mid-air. "All of them?" she asked. Jim nodded, twirling pasta around his fork. "We'll return their capital gradually. Moving forward, Medallion will only manage money for employees." "That's," Barbara searched for the right word, "unconventional." Jim chuckled. "Wall Street will think we've lost our minds, turning away billions in management fees." But it made perfect sense to him. The algorithms worked best with limited capital. The returns, hovering around 40 to 60% annually, were too good to dilute. And the structure created the ultimate alignment. Everyone working at Renaissance would have skin in the game. Their personal wealth would rise and fall with the firm's performance. Later that night, as rain pattered against the windows of his study, Jim reviewed the numbers. The 5% management and 20% performance fee structure had initially raised eyebrows among investors. Now it seemed almost quaint compared to what Medallion would become, a private money machine accessible only to those who contributed to its success. His personal wealth had crossed the $10 million threshold in the early 90s, a sum that would have seemed unimaginable during his academic days at Stony Brook. But Jim knew this was merely the beginning. The compounding engine they'd built was just warming up. The morning fog hugged the Long Island coastline as Jim drove to the office in spring 1994. The radio announcer discussed the day's headlines. The North American Free Trade Agreement, agreement's implementation, the emerging internet with its promising Mosaic browser, the slow recovery from recession gaining momentum. The world was changing, and few understood just how drastically technology would reshape it. Renaissance's offices remained deliberately understated. No gleaming skyscraper in Manhattan, no flashy signage announcing their presence. Just a nondescript building housing what had become the most sophisticated trading operation on the planet. Inside, the atmosphere resembled a university physics department more than a hedge fund. Whiteboards covered with equations lined the walls. Clusters of workstations ran simulations continuously. Conversations revolved around signal-to-noise ratios, processing power, and data acquisition. The pattern recognition systems caught something interesting in the overnight futures, said Nick Patterson, one of their key researchers, falling into step beside Jim in the hallway. It's subtle, but statistically significant across multiple instruments. Jim nodded. Have the execution systems been updated with the new latency improvements? Completed yesterday. We're shaving another few milliseconds off each trade. Those milliseconds mattered. While other firms still relied on human traders shouting orders or punching keyboards, Renaissance had eliminated human emotion and discretion from the equation. Their edge existed in that gap, the space between identifying a signal and executing before others even recognized the pattern. Later that afternoon, Jim gathered the research team to discuss talent acquisition. We need to be even more selective, he explained. The temptation will be to grow quickly, but that's not our model. We need extraordinary minds who understand they're building something unprecedented. The compensation structure is a powerful filter, noted one of the senior researchers. Not many firms offer employees the chance to invest in a fund returning 40% annually. Jim smiled. That's the point. We're not hiring employees, we're recruiting owners. The moat around Renaissance was deepening. Their proprietary data collection systems gathered information others ignored. Their PhD-heavy staff approached markets with scientific rigor rather than trader intuition. Their execution technology operated at speeds competitors couldn't match. And perhaps most importantly, their culture of secrecy preserved their edge. Renaissance researchers signed ND, as that would make intelligence agencies blush. As evening descended over Long Island Sound, Jim stood at his office window, watching lights flicker on across the harbor. The contrast between Renaissance's quiet operation and Wall Street's frenetic energy couldn't be more pronounced. While financial television debated market sentiment and celebrity CEOs made headlines, Renaissance simply calculated, executed, and compounded. We should celebrate, said Barbara, who had stopped by to take Jim to dinner. The new fee structure, the employee-only model, it's all working beautifully. Jim turned from the window. We're just getting started. What we've built here is going to change everything. For you, maybe. The world will never know most of what happens inside these walls. She was right. Renaissance's power came from its invisibility. The financial press occasionally mentioned a quant fund on Long Island, delivering extraordinary returns, but the details remained obscure. No CNBC interviews, no investor conferences, no press releases touting performance. At dinner that evening in a small bistro in Port Jefferson, Jim watched the normal rhythms of life unfold around him, couples dining, friends laughing, waiters bustling. None of them aware that at a nondescript building a few miles away, the nature of financial markets was being fundamentally reimagined. Do you ever miss mathematics? Barbara asked, knowing how his first love had been pure research, not its application. Jim considered the question. I never left it. What we're doing at Renaissance is mathematics, just applied to a different domain. He paused, sipping his wine. The beauty of it is the same, finding patterns where others see randomness, creating order from chaos. The waiter brought their dessert as the restaurant sound system played Nirvana's Come As You Are, the grunge anthem that had come to define the early 90s cultural landscape. The juxtaposition wasn't lost on Jim. the raw emotion of grunge against the cold precision of quantitative finance. As they drove home along the coastal road, Jim thought about the future. Medallion was now returning roughly 66% gross annually. After fees, employees were still seeing returns that defied conventional wisdom about what markets could deliver. But unlike the techno-utopians beginning to emerge in Silicon Valley, Jim harbored no illusions about changing the world through Renaissance. Their advantage came precisely from keeping their discoveries private, from limiting access rather than democratizing it. The moon cast a silver path across Long Island Sound as they pulled into their driveway. Inside the quiet house, Jim walked to his study and reviewed the day's performance figures one last time. The numbers confirmed what he already knew. They had built a perpetual motion machine, a system that could identify market inefficiencies, exploit them, and adapt as those inefficiencies disappeared. As he closed his laptop, Jim felt a rare sense of certainty. By deliberately constraining Medallion's size, by turning away outside capital, by sharing the wealth only with those who created it, Renaissance had chosen a path opposite to Wall Street's growth at all costs mentality. And in that counterintuitive choice lay their greatest strength. The golden goose would remain under guard, producing its extraordinary eggs only for those inside the walls of East Setauket, compounding in silence as the world changed around them. The lights of East Setauket dimmed as evening settled over the Long Island Sound. Jim Simon sat alone in his office, the blue glow of multiple monitors painting his face in artificial moonlight. Outside, autumn leaves skittered across the Renaissance Technologies parking lot, where a modest Honda Accord. His car stood among others no more ostentatious. The year was 1998, and while Wall Street shuddered under the collapse of long-term capital management, Medallion's algorithms hummed with quiet efficiency. Jim swiveled in his chair, removing his wire-rimmed glasses to rub the bridge of his nose. The screens before him displayed a fractal pattern of trading signals, positions unwinding and reforming across global markets with mathematical precision. The fund was up 47% year-to-date, even as markets convulsed from the Asian financial contagion. Still here? Henry Laufer appeared in the doorway, his rumpled Oxford shirt and khakis matching Jim's own understated attire. "Just watching the last of the Tokyo positions close," Jim replied, gesturing toward the screens. "The alpha clusters caught something interesting in the currency pairs this morning." Henry nodded, leaning against the doorframe. They'd known each other since Stony Brook, mathematics professors turned unlikely Wall Street revolutionaries. "LTCM's bailout is all over CNBC," Henry said quietly. 16 banks ponying up $3.6 billion to stop the bleeding. Jim's expression remained neutral, but a shadow crossed his features. Long-term capital's implosion wasn't shocking to him. Brilliant academics who'd forgotten that humility matters as much as intelligence. Nobel laureates Robert Merton and Myron Scholes had built elegant models, then leveraged them beyond reason. 100 to 1, Jim murmured, referring to LTCM's leverage ratio in its final days. Genius and arrogance make dangerous partners. The two men shared a moment of silence for what was, in some ways, a cautionary tale written explicitly for them. Renaissance used leverage too, perhaps 10 to 1 at times, but spread across hundreds of uncorrelated signals with rigorous risk parameters. "We could have been them," Henry said. Jim shook his head. "No, we wouldn't." His voice was soft but certain. "Too many eggs in too few baskets, no real-time feedback loops, too much faith in their own infallibility." He turned back to the screens, where Medallion's positions were adjusting microsecond by microsecond, thousands of small bets cancelling noise and amplifying signal. Renaissance's edge wasn't just the models, it was the infrastructure. The firm had invested millions in co-location facilities near exchanges, proprietary order routing algorithms, and DEC alpha workstations that squeezed milliseconds others couldn't capture. "Peter thinks we should upgrade the execution stack again," Jim said, referring to Peter Brown, one of the computer scientists who had transformed Renaissance from a mathematician's thought experiment into a precision instrument. Says we're leaving money on the table in the spreads. Henry nodded. The latency arbitrage is getting crowded. Everyone's chasing the same microseconds now. Jim rose, stretching his back. At 60, he still maintained the disciplined routine of a much younger man. Daily workouts, 7 hours of sleep, coffee but no alcohol during trading hours. The habits weren't vanity. They were the infrastructure of clear thinking. Let's continue this tomorrow, he said, glancing at his watch. Marilyn's waiting. The Simons' living room was warm against the November chill. Nothing ostentatious but comfortable in the way only old money or new money with old values can achieve. Jim sat with Bob Mercer and Peter Brown, Renaissance's computational architects, as they reviewed the basket option strategy Renaissance had begun implementing with Deutsche Bank and Barclays. The tax characterization is sound, said the tax attorney from a prestigious New York firm. The structure converts short-term gains to long-term capital gains through the options wrapper. Perfectly legal under the current code. Jim nodded, processing the implications. The strategy would reduce their tax liability from 35% to 15% on billions in trading profits. It was aggressive but within bounds, the kind of arbitrage Renaissance excelled at finding, whether in markets or regulations. And if the IRS challenges it? Jim asked quietly. We have substantial precedent on our side, the attorney replied. These are legitimate options, contracts with real economic substance. Jim considered this, tapping his fingers lightly on the arm of his chair. He'd built his life on the edges of systems, finding patterns others missed, exploiting inefficiencies others overlooked. This was no different, except perhaps in scale. Proceed, he finally said, but document everything exhaustively. I want this structure to withstand any scrutiny. After the meeting dispersed, Jim remained in the living room alone. He moved to the window, looking out at the Sound, distant lights from Connecticut shores twinkling across the dark water. His thoughts drifted to Nick, his son who had died in a car accident just 2 years earlier in 1996. The pain remained fresh, a mathematical problem with no solution. The tragedy had crystallized something in Jim. Money, for all its utility, couldn't protect against life's cruelest variables. It had reinforced his growing interest in philanthropy, in using his fortune not just for security, but for meaning. March 2000. The Nasdaq reached 5,000, then began its vertiginous decline as the dot-com bubble finally burst. Jim watched from Renaissance's expanded offices, now a campus-like setting that housed over 100 employees, mathematicians, physicists, signal processing experts, and computer scientists. None wore suits, all wore the unofficial uniform of academic brilliance, khakis and button-downs, occasionally jeans. The models called it, said Sandor Strauss, one of the early Renaissance scientists, internet valuations crossing into statistical impossibility 3 months ago. Jim nodded. Medallion had been positioning accordingly, shorting the frothiest tech stocks while maintaining its thousands of other uncorrelated positions. When markets moved, Renaissance didn't predict. It reacted faster and more systematically than anyone else. The market can stay irrational longer than most can stay solvent, Jim replied, quoting Keynes, but not longer than mathematics can stay patient. They walked through the research floor where clusters of Linux machines had replaced the DEC alphas of the previous decade. The computational infrastructure was Renaissance's moat custom hardware, running proprietary algorithms that processed terabytes of market data daily, learning and adjusting in real time. A young researcher approached with a printout. Dr. Simons, the new signal in Japanese equities, is showing strong results in backtesting. Jim took the paper, studying the statistical significance metrics. Run it through the correlation filter. Make sure it's not just picking up something we're already trading. This was the discipline that separated Renaissance from competitors. Rigorous testing, no shortcuts, constant questioning of assumptions. Jim had instituted strict protocols for model reviews, no phones, no distractions, total focus. When examining the signals that drove billions in capital, multitasking was forbidden. Later that afternoon, Jim sat in a meeting with Barclays representatives, reviewing the expanding basket options program. Renaissance now had billions in these structures, the tax efficiency compounding their returns even further. The bankers were deferential, aware they were in the presence of perhaps the greatest money-making machine in financial history. "The structures are performing exactly as designed," the Barclays executive said. "We've expanded capacity as requested." Jim nodded, his mind already elsewhere. That morning, he'd visited the fledgling Simons Foundation offices, where he and Marilyn were planning a significant expansion of their philanthropy. Mathematics, physics, and a new interest, autism research, were becoming his focus beyond the markets. August 2003. Jim stood at the window of his Manhattan apartment, looking out at Central Park as summer greenery swayed in the breeze. His phone rang, Peter Brown with the daily Medallion update. The fund was up 3.2% for the month, remarkable consistency in markets still finding their footing after the dot-com collapse and post-9/11 recession. But Jim barely registered the numbers. 5 months earlier, his son Paul had died in a bicycle accident at age 34, the second son he had lost. The weight of this second tragedy had changed him profoundly. At 65, with more money than he could spend in multiple lifetimes, Jim found himself contemplating legacy in new ways. The door opened, and Marilyn entered, her face showing the same grief that Jim carried, but with characteristic resolve. "The foundation directors are here," she said gently. Jim nodded, composing himself. They walked together to the dining room where 3 accomplished academics waited, the nucleus of what would become a major scientific funding organization. "We prepared the expansion plan," said the lead director, sliding a document across the table. "Significant scaling of mathematics and physical sciences grants and the new autism research initiative." Jim studied the proposal. The Simons Foundation, established formally in 1994 but now being dramatically expanded, would commit hundreds of millions to basic science research, the kind that federal funding is often overlooked. "I want to add computational biology," Jim said, "and I want all research we fund to be openly shared, no proprietary restrictions." The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Renaissance guarded its algorithms with obsessive secrecy, while the foundation would mandate radical openness. 2 sides of the same empirical coin. December 2004. Renaissance's end-of-year gathering filled the large atrium of their expanded East Setauket campus. Jim stood at the center, surrounded by the brilliant minds he'd assembled, over 200 employees now, most with PhDs, many with ownership stakes in the firm through their Medallion allocations. "Another exceptional year," Jim said, his voice carrying across the hushed room. Medallion had returned approximately 33% net to investors in 2004, another year of performance that defied conventional market wisdom. "Our edge remains our people and our infrastructure," he continued. "While others chase the obvious, we find signal in the noise." He didn't need to elaborate. Everyone understood Renaissance's advantage: the low-latency execution systems that could exploit fleeting arbitrage opportunities, the statistical models that detected patterns human traders would never see, the risk management that prevented any single failure from contaminating the whole. After the formal remarks, Jim circulated through the crowd, speaking briefly with key researchers. Unlike most Wall Street CEOs, he asked technical questions and expected technical answers. No simplifications, no management speak. Mathematics was still the lingua franca. "Jim," said Robert Mercer, approaching Peter Brown, "the new co-location facility in New Jersey is online. We're seeing execution times drop by 40%. Jim nodded appreciatively. The technological arms race never ended. Each millisecond saved translated to millions in additional profit. Renaissance had been early to co-location, placing servers physically adjacent to exchanges to minimize transmission delays. Later, as the gathering wound down, Jim found himself alone with Henry Lawfer on the building's rooftop terrace. The December air was cold, but both men seemed not to notice as they looked out over the Sound. 25 years since we started," Henry remarked. "Did you ever imagine this?" Jim smiled slightly. Not specifically this, but I always knew there were patterns waiting to be found. They stood in comfortable silence, two mathematicians who had decoded market inefficiencies with the same patient rigor they'd once applied to geometric problems at Stony Brook. "The Foundation's new autism initiative launches next month," Jim said finally. "Simon's Foundation Autism Research Initiative." Henry nodded. He understood what remained unspoken, that as Renaissance had matured into an institutional force, Jim's focus was increasingly on his philanthropic legacy. The deaths of his sons had accelerated this shift, channeling grief into purpose. "You're building something that will outlast all of us," Henry said quietly. Jim didn't respond immediately. The patterns of light across the soundboat traffic, distant homes, stars above, formed a complex system not unlike the markets they had spent decades decoding. His life had been devoted to finding order in apparent randomness, meaning in noise. "We all need something that outlasts us," he finally said. "For some, it's children. For others, ideas." As they turned to go inside, Jim cast one last glance at the night sky. Renaissance would continue its mathematical conquest of market inefficiencies. The Simons Foundation would expand its support of basic science, and he would navigate between these worlds, the secretive trading empire and the open scientific community, with the same quiet discipline that had defined his remarkable journey. The door closed behind them, and the sound continued its timeless rhythm, indifferent to the algorithms that had extracted billions from the world's markets, and to the man who had orchestrated it all from this unassuming corner of Long Island. The floor-to-ceiling windows of Renaissance Technologies' East Setauket headquarters framed the Long Island Sound in a tableau of gray and blue. Jim Simon stood with his hands clasped behind his back, smoke from his cigarette curling upward in lazy spirals. At 67, his trim beard had gone completely white, but his eyes remained sharp behind his glasses. Mathematician's eyes, always calculating. "The numbers don't lie," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Reef is performing exactly as we predicted." Peter Brown nodded, leafing through the performance report. Renaissance Institutional Equities Fund, their external offering had delivered solid double-digit returns, respectable by any normal standard. Yet both men knew it paled beside Medallion, their employee-only fund that continued its seemingly impossible streak of 40% annual returns. "The capacity constraints are working as expected," Peter replied. "We're seeing the dilution effect in real time." "Which is precisely why we keep Medallion closed," Jim said. "There's a natural ceiling to how much our strategies can manage without degrading. Wall Street never wants to hear about limits." This was the fundamental truth Jim had discovered over decades of quantitative trading. Alpha evaporates when spread too thin. While hedge funds typically chased ever larger assets under management, Renaissance had done something extraordinary, capped their flagship Medallion Fund at approximately $10 billion and returned excess profits to its employee owners. "The new rider fund structure is ready," Robert Mercer said, entering the room with a stack of documents. Tall and reserved, Mercer had joined Renaissance in the early 1990s from IBM, a computer scientist whose language models had revolutionized voice recognition. Now he was co-heading their most ambitious external offering yet, Renaissance Institutional Diversified Alpha. "Good," Jim nodded. "But make sure all prospective investors understand, these are solid returns, not Medallion magic." The summer of 2007 arrived with an unsettling electricity in the financial air. Housing prices had climbed to dizzying heights, mortgage-backed securities traded like blue chips, and credit flowed as freely as champagne at a Gatsby party. On Wall Street, confidence bordered on hubris. In Renaissance's data center, alarm bells began ringing. Not literal bells, but the digital equivalent patterns in the market that defied statistical norms. "It's happening across the board," said one of the senior researchers, pointing to screens showing unusual correlations. "Every quant shop is seeing the same dislocations." What would later be known as the quant quake was beginning. Quantitative funds across Wall Street were simultaneously experiencing the same fatal error. Models built on decades of historical patterns suddenly broke down as positions crowded by multiple firms unwound in a cascading effect. Jim gathered the senior team in the conference room, its walls covered in whiteboards filled with equations. "What are we seeing that others aren't?" he asked calmly. For 3 days, Renaissance's researchers worked around the clock. While competitors like Goldman Sachs's quant division and AQR suffered heavy losses, Medallion's shorter-term holding periods and broader signal diversity allowed it to adjust. Reef wobbled but stabilized. The lesson was clear and sobering. Even the most sophisticated mathematical models could fail when everyone ran for the same exit. "The difference between us and them," Jim later explained to his senior team. "We never forgot that markets are complex adaptive systems. The moment you think you've solved them is the moment you're most vulnerable." The collapse of Lehman Brothers in September 2008 sent shockwaves through global markets. The Great Recession had begun in earnest. As financial institutions toppled like dominoes and the S&P 500 plummeted, Renaissance's offices remained strangely serene. Medallion wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. The fund would end 2008 up approximately 80%, a performance so outlandish in a year when most investors lost a third of their wealth that it seemed to defy financial gravity. "Volatility creates opportunity," Jim explained during a rare internal address to the company's growing research staff, now numbering over 300 PhDs. "Our systems are designed to identify dislocations and profit from them, regardless of direction." The contrast couldn't have been starker outside. Unemployment climbed toward 10%, foreclosures mounted, and retirement accounts were decimated. Inside Renaissance's campus-like setting, researchers quietly earned bonuses that would exceed $10 million for top contributors. Jim was acutely aware of this dissonance. In private conversations, he struggled with the ethical dimensions of profiting during widespread suffering, even as he took pride in the intellectual achievement that Renaissance represented. "We're not causing the downturn," he told his wife Marilyn one evening at their home overlooking the Sound. "The system we've built is doing exactly what it was designed to do: find inefficiencies and correct them." "I know," she replied, touching his hand. "That's why the foundation becomes more important every year." The Simons Foundation had grown in parallel with Renaissance's success, focusing on mathematics, basic sciences, and autism research. For Jim, it represented a different kind of legacy than Medallion One, measured not in returns but in discoveries. January 2009 brought a decisive shift. After nearly 30 years building Renaissance from a small commodities trading operation into the most successful quantitative investment firm in history, Jim Simons announced his retirement as CEO. The handoff to co-CEOs Peter Brown and Robert Mercer had been meticulously planned. Both men had been with the firm for nearly 2 decades, architects of the computational infrastructure that made Medallion possible. "This isn't goodbye," Jim assured the assembled employees in the company auditorium. "I'm remaining as non-executive chairman. I'll still attend research meetings, but day-to-day operations are in Peter and Robert's capable hands." At 71, his focus was shifting. The foundation was expanding rapidly, and his philanthropic ambitions had grown to match his financial success. Yet he maintained his ownership stake in Renaissance, ensuring both control and continued participation in Medallion's returns. Later that evening, alone in his office, he ran his hand along the spines of mathematical texts that lined his shelves. Chern's work on differential geometry, papers on algebraic topology, remnants of his first career. The equations had always been his true north, even when applied to markets instead of manifolds. "Just a mathematician who got lucky," he murmured, repeating the self-effacing line he often used with journalists. Part genuine modesty, part strategic deflection. The math behind Renaissance's success remained the most closely guarded secret on Wall Street. The hiring machine at Renaissance had evolved into a well-oiled system unlike anything else in finance. Traditional Wall Street credentials, MBAs from Harvard or Wharton, years at Goldman Sachs, counted for little. Instead, Renaissance sought raw intellectual horsepower, particularly from physics, mathematics, and computer science. In a conference room overlooking the company's pond, Jim observed as potential recruits tackled problems designed to test not just intelligence, but creative pattern recognition. "What do you think?" asked one of the senior researchers after a young physicist from Caltech had left. His approach to the third problem was elegant, Jim replied. "Different angle than anyone else took. That's what we need, people who don't follow the conventional path." Renaissance's compensation system had also evolved into something unique. While base salaries were generous, often $1 to $5 million for senior researchers, the real wealth came through ownership stakes in Medallion. Top contributors could earn between $10 to $50 million annually, a structure that turned academics with modest expectations into centimillionaires. "The beauty is in the incentive alignment," Jim explained to a visitor from Math for America, his educational foundation. "If your ideas generate alpha, you participate directly in that success. No politics, no favoritism, just empirical results." This meritocracy created both collaboration and healthy competition. Renaissance had no star. System ideas were rigorously tested regardless of their source, and a junior researcher could see her algorithm implemented alongside the work of veterans. "We're a bit like a university physics department," Jim once observed, "except we pay better and the problems change daily." The tranquility of East Setauket felt far removed from Washington, D.C. in July 2014, as Jim prepared to testify before the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. The hearing room's wooden panels and senatorial grandstanding created a theater of accountability that made the mathematician distinctly uncomfortable. The focus, Renaissance's use of basket options, complex derivatives that had allowed Medallion to classify short-term trading gains as long-term capital gains, reducing the tax rate from 35% to 15%. While legal and approved by both banks and tax counsel, the strategy had saved Renaissance billions in taxes. "Mr. Simons," intoned Senator Carl Levin, "do you believe these transactions had economic substance beyond tax avoidance?" Jim leaned toward the microphone, his voice steady. "Senator, these transactions absolutely had economic substance. They provided efficient execution and appropriate leverage for our trading strategies. The tax treatment was determined by our advisors to be compliant with existing law." Behind the composed exterior, Jim recognized the broader implications. In a post-financial crisis world where inequality had become a political flashpoint, Renaissance's extraordinary wealth generation had made it a target. The optics were undeniably problematic, billionaire mathematicians paying lower tax rates than middle-class families. Later, in his hotel room, he called Marilyn. "How did it go?" she asked. "About as expected. They wanted theater, not technical explanation." He sighed. "The truth is, we followed the rules as they existed. If Congress wants different rules, they should write them." "And would you have done things differently, knowing what you know now?" Jim paused, considering. "The structures were legal, but perhaps we should have anticipated how they'd appear in a different political climate. It's a calculation we missed." The autumn air carried a crisp edge as Jim stood at the podium in MIT's lecture hall. Behind him, slides showed mathematical notation and statistical distributions, familiar terrain for a man who had spent his life translating abstract concepts into practical applications. This 2014 lecture represented a rare public discussion of Renaissance's approach, carefully calibrated to reveal philosophy without methodology. The audience, professors, students, and financial professionals leaned forward, hoping to glimpse the secret behind the most successful investment firm in history. "I estimate our success is 70% skill, 30% luck," Jim said, adjusting his glasses. "The skill isn't in predicting any single move. It's in building systems that recognize subtle patterns across thousands of instruments simultaneously." He explained Renaissance's preference for hiring physicists, their comfort with noisy data and complex systems, and the importance of rigorous testing. We don't trade anything unless the expected return shows statistical significance at the 3 sigma level, he continued. Most patterns people think they see in markets are illusions. You need enough data and enough tests to separate signal from noise. A student raised his hand. Sir, if your models are so successful, why haven't others replicated them? Jim smiled. For the same reason that knowing the laws of thermodynamics doesn't make you a master chef. The ingredients matter, but so does the recipe, and the recipe includes 30 years of institutional knowledge, proprietary data processing, and execution infrastructure that can't simply be copied. The lecture revealed Jim's careful balancing act, managing Renaissance's mythology without exposing its methods. The just a mathematician who got lucky persona served both as genuine humility and strategic deflection, while the media increasingly portrayed him as possibly the greatest investor in history. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in between, in the culture he had built, the talent he had assembled, and the systems that continued to compound wealth long after his retirement from day-to-day management. As 2014 drew to a close, Jim Simons stood at an inflection point. At 76, his mathematical legacy was secure. The Chern-Simons theory had become fundamental in physics, while Medallion's performance had rewritten what was thought possible in financial markets. The Renaissance he had built had matured from a maverick operation into an institution. The transition to Brown and Mercer's leadership had proceeded smoothly, though not without friction, as Mercer's controversial political activities occasionally created unwelcome attention. The Senate investigation into basket auctions had resulted in recommendations for regulatory changes, but no penalties. Renaissance had already begun adapting its tax structures, recognizing that the political climate had shifted. Jim's philanthropic footprint had expanded dramatically. The Simons Foundation now rivaled major institutional funders in mathematics and basic science, while its autism research initiative was producing breakthrough findings in genetics. In his home office, Jim reviewed reports from both Renaissance and the Foundation. The contrasts were striking. One organization shrouded in secrecy, its discoveries jealously guarded, the other committed to open science, publishing all findings freely. Different tools for different problems, he murmured. The phone rang. Peter Brown with the latest performance numbers. Despite all the scrutiny, despite all the changes in markets and technology, Medallion continued its seemingly impossible streak. The system worked, even as the world around it transformed. Outside, snow began to fall over the Sound, turning the water a deeper slate gray. Jim watched the flakes swirl in patterns that seemed random but contained hidden structure, much like the market data that had occupied his intellectual life for 3 decades. There was elegance in both the mathematics and the machine he had built to harness it. Renaissance had become more than a company. It was a new way of understanding markets as mathematical objects, susceptible to rigorous analysis rather than emotion or intuition. Not bad, Jim said quietly to himself, for a mathematician who got lucky. The snow continued to fall as night descended, covering East Setauket in a blanket of white that simplified its contours, much as Jim's models had found simplicity in the chaos of markets patterns invisible to the naked eye, but revealed through the lens of mathematics. The Manhattan skyline glittered beyond the windows of the Flatiron Institute, the newly christened temple to computational science that Jim Simons had built in the heart of New York City. It was 2016, and as the evening shadows lengthened across the Institute's sleek corridors, Simons walked quietly among the workstations, where some of the world's brightest minds had gathered, physicists, mathematicians, biologists, all drawn by the promise of unfettered research and the considerable resources his fortune had made possible. "You've outdone yourself, Jim," murmured the Institute's director, trailing behind him. 200 researchers, 5 computational centers. It's unprecedented. Simons nodded slightly, his wispy white beard catching the blue light of nearby monitors. At 78, he moved with the deliberate pace of a man who had nothing left to prove, yet everything still to discover. His gaze lingered on a whiteboard filled with elegant equations. The tools should be open source, he said softly. Science advances when knowledge flows freely. The market is different. There, secrets have value. But here, he gestured at the researchers hunched over their keyboards. Here, we share. The irony wasn't lost on him. The very fortune that funded this cathedral of open science had been built on algorithms, so closely guarded that Renaissance Technologies employees signed non-disclosure agreements stricter than those at intelligence agencies. Medallion, his flagship fund, remained the most successful black box in financial history, with 66% gross returns, 39% net, sustained across 3 decades. A mathematical miracle that had transformed him from an academic into one of the wealthiest men in America. The following morning, Jim sat in his office at Euclidean Capital, the family office that managed his personal wealth. Outside, spring was painting Manhattan with tentative color, but inside, the screens showed only numbers, the rational universe he'd mastered. His personal net worth had reached astronomical heights, somewhere around $18 billion and climbing. The figure meant less to him than most assumed. The Charlie Rose interview went well, said his assistant, placing a coffee on his desk. They're saying the TED Talk has over 1 million views now. Jim nodded absently. His recent steps into the public eye had been calculated. A TED Talk in 2015 about mathematics and markets, the Charlie Rose interview about his philanthropy. After decades of anonymity, he'd decided that certain messages were worth delivering personally. The value of mathematical thinking, the responsibility of extreme wealth, the power of computational approaches to science's hardest problems. "Any word from Robert?" he asked, referring to Robert Mercer, Renaissance's co-CEO and a man whose politics had begun to create turbulence around the carefully cultivated Renaissance brand. "Nothing new," his assistant replied cautiously. The Mercer situation troubled him. Robert Mercer, brilliant computer scientist and Renaissance co-CEO, had become a significant funder of far-right causes, Breitbart News, the Trump campaign, Cambridge Analytica. The political division wasn't the issue. Renaissance had always been home to varied political views. The problem was the attention it brought, the reputational bleed, the questions about data misuse. Renaissance thrived on invisibility. Mercer's activities made that impossible. By late 2017, the situation had become untenable. In his Long Island home, Jim sat across from Peter Brown, the other Renaissance co-CEO, discussing the inevitable. "He's stepping down?" Jim asked, though he already knew the answer. Peter nodded. "Effective January. He'll remain on the board, but I'll be sole CEO. He understands the position we're in." Jim exhaled slowly. It's the right decision, for him and for Renaissance. The firm he built over decades had always operated on principles that transcended politics. Hire the smartest people regardless of background, test everything rigorously, trust data over intuition, and maintain absolute secrecy about methodologies. Mercer's high-profile political activities had threatened that carefully cultivated invisibility. The market turbulence of the next few years barely registered on Medallion's returns. The fund remained remarkably consistent even as the broader economy shuddered through trade wars, political chaos, and the first tremors of what would become the COVID-19 pandemic. In 2019, Jim found himself in an unfamiliar setting, testifying before Congress about quantitative trading. The hearing room hummed with anticipation as he carefully explained the role of algorithmic trading in providing market liquidity, the importance of regulatory guardrails, and the mathematics that undergirded modern financial markets. He was precise, measured, and revealed nothing of proprietary value, the balance he'd always maintained between transparency and protecting his edge. "Mr. Simons," asked a congressman, "given the extraordinary returns your fund has generated, do you believe markets are truly efficient?" A ghost of a smile crossed Jim's face. "Markets are efficient enough to make consistent success very difficult," he answered, "but inefficient enough that with the right tools, discipline, and capacity constraints, patterns can be identified and exploited. It's not a contradiction, it's a spectrum. The pandemic that engulfed the world in 2020 brought unforeseen challenges. Renaissance's non-Medallion funds struggled in the chaotic markets, while Medallion itself demonstrated remarkable resilience. But a public relations crisis emerged when news broke that Renaissance employees had received PPP loans, government assistance meant for struggling small businesses. In his home office, now the command center from which he navigated the pandemic-transformed world, Jim made the call immediately: return the money. It's an optics disaster, he told Peter Brown over a secure line. Whatever the legal technicalities, we can't have Renaissance associated with taking taxpayer assistance, return every dollar. The funds were repaid promptly. The statement kept brief, the incident contained, but it reinforced Jim's growing awareness that, in an age of populist anger toward the ultra-wealthy, even the quietest billionaires were subject to intense scrutiny. A more substantial reckoning arrived in 2021, the resolution of a years-long IRS dispute over the tax treatment of Renaissance's basket option strategy. The settlement was massive, approximately $7 billion total across the firm and its employees, with roughly $670 million attributed to Jim personally. On a rain-spattered afternoon, he sat with his tax advisors reviewing the settlement terms. It's one of the largest tax settlements in history, noted his lead counsel, sliding the paperwork across the table. Jim signed without hesitation. We tested the boundaries of the tax code, the IRS disagreed with our interpretation, and now we pay. That's how the system works. The matter was closed, the uncertainty eliminated. Through it all, the Simons Foundation continued its ascent as one of the world's premier scientific philanthropies. By 2022, its endowment approached $5 billion, with annual giving between $500 million and $700 million. The Autism Research Initiative, SFARI, had built a database of over 100,000 families, identifying more than 100 risk genes. Math for America had trained over 1,000 New York City math teachers. The Flatiron Institute had published hundreds of citable papers, developing open-source tools used by researchers worldwide. On a crisp autumn morning in 2023, Jim toured the Flatiron Institute with his daughter Liz, who had taken on an increasingly significant role in the Foundation's governance. They paused before a display of the Institute's computational astrophysics work simulations of galaxy formation rendered in breathtaking detail. When I started in mathematics, Jim reflected, computation was an afterthought. Now it's as fundamental to discovery as the microscope was to biology. We're helping science see the unseeable. Liz nodded. And unlike Medallion, everyone gets to use these tools. He smiled at the gentle ribbing. Different domains, different rules. Markets reward secrecy, science rewards sharing. As 2024 approached, Jim Simons had achieved a rarity in American capitalism. He had built not one but two empires. Renaissance Technologies, with approximately $130 billion under management, and the still legendary Medallion Fund, capped at $10 billion employee money only, continued to defy financial gravity. And the Simons Foundation had become a scientific powerhouse, funding breakthrough research across mathematics, physics, biology, and neuroscience. The succession plan was clear. Peter Brown would continue as Renaissance CEO, his daughter Liz and other family members would guide the foundation, Euclidean Capital would manage the family office. The architecture of his wealth, estimated at $31.5 billion by Forbes, had been carefully structured into trusts and philanthropic vehicles. In the early spring of 2024, Jim spent more time at home, his health gradually declining. He still attended foundation meetings, particularly those related to origins of life research, his latest scientific passion. The quest to understand how the complexity of life emerged from chemistry fascinated him. It was the ultimate pattern recognition problem. On May 10, 2024, in his New York City apartment, Jim Simons passed away at age 86. The news traveled through financial markets, academic institutions, and philanthropic circles with remarkable speed. The statements that followed from colleagues, beneficiaries, and even rivals painted a picture of a singular mind, a mathematician who had unlocked patterns others couldn't see in both pure theory and applied finance. His legacy would unfold across three domains: in mathematics, where Chern-Simons theory remained a cornerstone of modern topology and theoretical physics; in finance, where Renaissance had redefined what was possible through algorithmic trading; and in philanthropy, where his data-driven approach to giving had transformed fields from autism research to computational science. In the days after his death, a quote from his rare 2015 TED Talk circulated widely: "The best people in any field are quite smart. The very best people are both very smart and very hard-working and determined. But to rise to the top and stay there, you need one more ingredient. You need luck." It was classic. Simons deflecting credit to fortune while obscuring the ruthless intellectual discipline that had allowed him to build systems that consistently bent probability in his favor. He had never been comfortable with the mythology that surrounded him. He preferred the concrete reality of equations, algorithms, and results. The financial implications of his passing were substantial. An estimated estate tax bill that could reach $12 billion, one of the largest in American history. But the intellectual and institutional inheritance was incalculable. Renaissance would continue its quiet dominance. The Simons Foundation would fund the next generation of scientific breakthroughs, and somewhere in universities and hedge funds around the world, ambitious minds would study his methods, hoping to replicate even a fraction of his success. As one obituary noted, Jim Simons had cracked not just markets but the deeper code of how to convert mathematical insight into enduring impact. He had lived by a principle expressed in another memorable quote: "I don't want to keep score with money. I'd rather fund the next Einstein than buy another yacht." In the end, Jim Simons had achieved something rarer than wealth. He had transformed abstract patterns in geometry, in market data, in genetic sequences, into concrete progress. The mathematics of a life, perfectly computed. Thanks for listening. Do not forget to subscribe, like the video, leave a comment, and share the videos with friends.